Hello, friends. About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did. Also, don't forget to press the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. From which country or city do you follow the channel? My name is Daniel Everson, but most people just call me Dan. I'm a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. It's not just a job for me, it's my way of keeping the past buried. You see, before this, I was a Navy SEAL. I spent years diving into the darkest depths of the ocean, doing things I can't talk about. But one mission went wrong, really wrong. Since then, tight spaces and dark waters have haunted me. The caves, though, they're different. I can control them, map them, understand them. They make sense. It was spring of 1991 and the rain wouldn't stop. Days of heavy downpours had flooded parts of the cave system that hadn't seen water in decades. It was a mess. Tourists were stranded, and we were running rescue operations non-stop. That's when it all started. I was leading a team to find a group of spelunkers who had gotten trapped in one of the lower chambers. The water was rising fast, and time wasn't on our side. As we moved deeper into the cave, something strange happened. The echoes, those normal sounds you hear bouncing off the walls, they weren't right. They were sharper, almost like whispers cutting through the air. "Dan," Franklin Walsh said, shining his flashlight ahead. Franklin was an old-timer who'd been guiding tours here for decades. "You hear that?" I nodded, but didn't answer. I didn't want to spook anyone. Rusty, my therapy dog, a loyal Labrador trained for cave rescues, was with us too. He stopped suddenly, ears perked up, staring into the darkness like he'd seen something. Rusty never acted like that, unless there was trouble. We found the spelunkers huddled on a ledge above the rising water, scared but alive. As we helped them back to safety, those strange echoes followed us the whole way out. They sounded almost like voices, soft and distant, but no one else seemed to notice. That night, as I sat in my cabin drying off Rusty and going over maps of newly discovered passages, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right in those caves. Franklin stopped by with coffee and told me about an old legend his family used to tell, the story of the pale swimmers. "They're old tales," he said with a shrug. "Creatures that live deep in the caves where no light ever touches. My granddad swore he saw one once when he was a boy." I laughed it off at first, but deep down I couldn't ignore what I'd felt earlier. The whispers, Rusty's reaction, something was down there. The rain didn't let up. By the next morning, the flooding had gotten worse, swallowing parts of the cave system we hadn't explored yet. I was called in to check out a newly revealed chamber. The water had carved through the rock, opening up a passage no one had ever seen before. Franklin came along, and so did Dr. Tanya Morris, a geologist studying the caves for unusual formations. Rusty trotted by my side, his tail wagging like he didn't have a care in the world. The new chamber was eerie. The walls were covered in strange carvings, petroglyphs of humanoid figures with long limbs and no faces. Tanya ran her hand over them, her eyes wide with curiosity. "These are ancient," she whispered, "but they don't match anything I've seen before." Franklin stood back, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "Pale swimmers," he muttered under his breath. I didn't say anything, but my gut told me he wasn't far off. As we moved deeper into the chamber, the air grew colder and the echoes returned. Those sharp whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rusty stopped again, growling softly this time. Tanya knelt to collect a water sample near the edge of a flooded tunnel. "Dan," she said, holding up the vial, "this isn't normal water. There's something organic in it." Before I could ask what she meant, Franklin shouted from ahead, "Over here!" We rushed to him and found something that made my stomach drop. Equipment scattered across the floor, a flashlight, a helmet, and a notebook, all belonging to 3 researchers who had gone missing earlier that week. But there was no sign of them anywhere. Rusty barked suddenly, his fur standing on end as he stared into the flooded tunnel ahead. I shone my flashlight into the water, but saw nothing except ripples breaking the surface. Then came the sound, a low hum that vibrated through the rock, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. "Let's go," I said quickly, pulling Tanya and Franklin back toward the exit. As we climbed out of the chamber, Tanya stumbled and grabbed her arm. "It burns," she said, wincing in pain. "What burns?" I asked. "The water," she replied weakly. "It touched me." I didn't know what was happening to her, but I knew we couldn't stay down there any longer. Back at base camp, Tanya's condition worsened. Her skin near where the water had touched her turned pale and blotchy, almost translucent. She complained of hearing voices, soft whispers calling her back to the caves. Meanwhile, sonar equipment set up near the flooded tunnels picked up movement, large objects swimming deep below us. Franklin's face turned pale when he saw the readings. "They're awake," he said quietly. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "The pale swimmers," he replied. "They only come out when the caves flood." Tanya's condition wasn't getting any better. Her arm looked worse, almost like the skin was thinning, turning translucent. She kept mumbling about the voices she heard, saying they were calling her back. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those caves wasn't done with us yet. The sonar readings showed more movement, large, slow shapes gliding through the flooded tunnels. Franklin didn't want to go back down there, and honestly, I didn't blame him. But I needed answers. If those researchers were still alive, we had to find them. And if Tanya's infection was connected to the water, we needed to figure out what was causing it. I geared up for another dive into the chamber. This time I brought extra lights and sonar equipment to track anything moving in the water. Rusty stayed close, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Franklin insisted on coming with me, even though I could see the fear in his eyes. The flooded tunnel was darker than anything I'd ever seen before. My flashlight barely cut through the murky water as we swam deeper, following the sonar signals. The echoes returned, those sharp whispers, but now they sounded like voices. They weren't words exactly, but they felt human. Rusty barked suddenly, his paws splashing in the shallow water as he stared ahead. I turned my flashlight toward where he was looking and froze. Something moved in the water. At first, I thought it was a fish or maybe debris drifting with the current. But then it surfaced. A pale shape with long, thin limbs and skin so translucent I could see its veins beneath. It had no eyes, just smooth skin where a face should have been. It tilted its head toward us like it could sense we were there. "Dan," Franklin whispered, his voice trembling, "we need to go." The creature slipped back into the water without making a sound, disappearing into the darkness. My heart pounded as I tried to process what I'd just seen. We pushed forward cautiously until we reached another chamber, a massive space carved out by centuries of flooding. The walls were covered in more petroglyphs, but these were different. They showed scenes of creatures like the one we'd just seen hunting humans. In the center of the chamber was something even stranger, piles of human remains arranged in what looked like a ritual pattern, bones stacked neatly, skulls placed in a circle. It wasn't random. Franklin grabbed my arm tightly. "This isn't natural," he said. "They're not just animals." Before I could respond, my helmet camera picked up movement again, several pale shapes swimming just below the surface of the water surrounding us. They moved fast, too fast for anything human. Then came the sound, the low hum from before, but this time it was louder and sharper. It felt like it was inside my head, pulling at my thoughts and making it hard to focus. Rusty barked furiously as one of the creatures emerged from the water, its bioluminescent markings glowing faintly in the dark. The glow seemed to pulse, almost hypnotic, and for a moment I felt myself drawn to it, like it was pulling me closer. "Dan!" Franklin shouted, snapping me out of it. I grabbed Rusty and backed away slowly as more creatures surfaced around us. Their movements were smooth and deliberate, like they were studying us or hunting us. I don't know how we made it out of that chamber. The creatures didn't chase us, but I could feel their presence watching, waiting. Franklin was pale as a ghost, and Rusty wouldn't stop growling. Back at base camp, I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Tanya was worse now. Her skin had turned almost completely translucent, and she kept muttering about the deep ones and the call. She wasn't making any sense. I started digging through old records, trying to find anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I came across something I wasn't supposed to see. Classified military documents from the 1950s. They talked about sound experiments conducted in the caves, tests on low-frequency vibrations, and their effects on living organisms. The reports mentioned strange sightings during the experiments, but the project was shut down abruptly. No reason was given. It all started to click. The creatures, the pale swimmers, they weren't just animals. They were something more, something ancient, and they used sound to hunt, to communicate, maybe even to control their prey. I knew we couldn't just leave things as they were. Those caves were flooded now, and the creatures were active. If we didn't do something, more people would go missing, or worse. I modified some of our diving equipment with high-intensity lights and acoustic deterrents, devices designed to emit frequencies that might disrupt the creature's echolocation. Franklin thought I was crazy for going back down there, but he agreed to help me set up explosives to seal off the deepest passages. The dive back into the caves was tense. Every sound echoed differently now, sharper and more deliberate, like the caves themselves were alive. Rusty stayed close, his ears twitching at every noise. We reached the ceremonial chamber again, and this time it was worse than before. More remains had been added to the piles, fresh ones. I recognized one of the helmets as belonging to one of the missing researchers. The creatures were there too, swimming just below the surface of the water. Their bioluminescent markings glowed faintly in the dark, pulsing in patterns that felt almost hypnotic. I set up the explosives quickly while Franklin kept watch. Rusty growled softly, his eyes locked on the water. Then it happened. One of the creatures emerged from the water right in front of us. It stood tall on its elongated limbs, its translucent skin shimmering in the light. It tilted its head toward me like it could sense my fear. The hum returned, louder and sharper than ever before, and I felt my thoughts slipping away. Memories flashed through my mind, my time as a Navy SEAL, the mission that went wrong, everything I'd tried to forget. "Dan!" Franklin shouted, shaking me out of it. I activated one of the acoustic deterrents, and the creature recoiled instantly, slipping back into the water with an unnatural screech. The others followed, retreating into the depths as the sound filled the chamber. We didn't wait around after that. I triggered the explosives remotely as we swam back toward safety. The blast shook the caves violently, collapsing parts of the passageways and sealing off the deepest chambers where the creatures lived. The explosion worked. The deepest passages were sealed, and the creatures, at least the ones we saw, were trapped behind tons of rock. The hum stopped, and the caves fell silent again. But the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt hollow, like something was still watching us. Franklin and I made it back to the surface, exhausted and shaken. Rusty stayed close, his tail wagging weakly as if he knew we'd survived something terrible. But the relief didn't last long. Tanya was gone. She disappeared while we were in the caves. Her cabin was empty, her belongings untouched, and there was no sign of where she might have gone. All that was left was a trail of wet footprints leading toward the cave entrance. I searched for her for hours, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. But deep down I knew she wasn't coming back. Whatever had happened to her, whatever that water had done, she belonged to them now. The National Park Service issued a statement the next day, saying the new passages were unstable and dangerous. They restricted access to most of the flooded areas, citing safety concerns. But I knew the truth. Those caves weren't just dangerous. They were alive with something ancient and deadly. I tried to move on after that, but it wasn't easy. 4 members of our team were dead. Tanya was gone, and Franklin refused to talk about what we'd seen. Rusty stayed by my side like always, but even he seemed different. Quieter, more watchful. Weeks later, I started hearing reports from other parks in the region, stories about strange sightings near flooded cave systems. People talked about pale figures swimming in underground lakes, or whispers echoing through empty tunnels. I knew it wasn't over. One night I packed my gear, lights, acoustic deterrents, everything I could think of, and loaded it into my truck. Rusty hopped into the passenger seat without hesitation, his eyes fixed on me like he understood what we were doing. I wasn't just a park ranger anymore. I was a hunter, a protector, and I wouldn't let those creatures take anyone else. As I drove toward the next cave system where sightings had been reported, I couldn't help but wonder how many of them were out there and how deep their world really went. The first stop was Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Local rangers had reported strange sounds, and unexplained disappearances after heavy rainfall had flooded parts of the lower caves. Nothing as dramatic as what we'd experienced at Mammoth, but enough to make me suspect the pale swimmers had found another way out. I introduced myself as a specialist in cave biology, studying the effects of flooding on subterranean ecosystems. It wasn't entirely a lie. The head ranger, a woman named Andrea Reyes, seemed relieved to have someone taking their report seriously. 3 tourists went missing last month, she told me as we walked through the main cavern. Search and rescue found nothing, not even tracks. It's like they vanished into thin air. Were any of the missing people exhibiting strange behavior before they disappeared? I asked, remembering Tanya's deterioration. Andrea gave me a curious look. How did you know? One of them, a college student, kept complaining about hearing voices in the caves. The doctors thought it was the beginnings of schizophrenia, but now I'm not so sure. I nodded, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. They were here too. That night, I prepared my equipment in the ranger station. Andrea had given me access to all the maps and reports they had on the newly flooded areas. Rusty paced nervously around the room, his ears perked up at every little sound. He sensed something was wrong, just like he had at Mammoth. "What's going on, Dan?" Andrea asked, watching me check the acoustic deterrents. "You're not really a biologist, are you?" I hesitated, then decided she deserved to know what we were up against. I told her everything, about the pale swimmers, about Tanya and the missing researchers, about what Franklin and I had seen in those deep chambers. I expected her to laugh, to call me crazy, but she just listened, her face growing more serious with each word. "I've heard stories," she said when I was finished. "Old stories from the native tribes around here. They talk about the hollow people who live in the dark places beneath the earth. I always thought they were just legends." "They're not," I said quietly, "and they're spreading." We entered the caves the next morning, following the path the missing tourists had taken. Andrea insisted on coming with me, despite my warnings. Rusty led the way, his nose to the ground, tracking some scent only he could detect. The main tourist path was dry and well lit, but as we moved deeper, following one of the smaller side passages, we started to see signs of the recent flooding. Water stains marked the walls, and in places, the path was still muddy. The air grew colder as we descended. That familiar feeling of unease settled over me, the sense that something was watching us from the shadows. Rusty stopped suddenly, growling at a narrow crack in the wall. I shone my flashlight into the gap and saw what looked like a tunnel, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the floor was slick with mud. "Was this on any of your maps?" I asked Andrea. She shook her head. "This wasn't here before the flooding. The water must have eroded a new passage." I knew we had to follow it. If the pale swimmers were using these new tunnels to move between cave systems, we needed to find them, to stop them before they spread further. The passage was tight, uncomfortable. My old claustrophobia threatened to surface, but I pushed it down. I couldn't afford to panic, not now. Rusty went first, then me, with Andrea bringing up the rear. "Stay close," I whispered, "and if you hear anything strange, tell me immediately." The tunnel widened gradually, opening into a small chamber with several other passages branching off from it. The walls were wet, glistening in the beam of our flashlights. And there, carved into the stone, were the same strange petroglyphs I'd seen at Mammoth. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs and smooth, featureless faces. Andrea stared at them, her flashlight trembling slightly. "They've been here all along," she whispered. Before I could respond, Rusty started barking frantically, his eyes fixed on one of the other tunnels. Then I heard it, the familiar hum, low at first but growing steadily louder. It vibrated through the rock, through my body, making my teeth ache and my thoughts scatter. "Cover your ears," I shouted to Andrea, activating one of the acoustic deterrents. The device emitted a high-frequency pulse designed to disrupt the hum. It worked momentarily, the vibrations faltering. But then the hum returned, changing pitch, adapting. They were learning. I grabbed Andrea's arm and pulled her back toward the entrance tunnel. "We need to go now." But it was too late. Something pale and slick emerged from the water pooled at the base of one of the other tunnels. It moved with unnatural grace. its elongated limbs carrying it across the chamber faster than should have been possible. Rusty lunged at it, teeth bared, but the creature swatted him aside effortlessly. He hit the wall with a yelp and lay still. "Rusty!" I shouted, drawing my knife. It was a poor weapon against something like this, but it was all I had. The creature turned toward me, its featureless face tilting curiously. The hum intensified, focused now, drilling into my mind. I tried to resist, to hold on to my thoughts, but they were slipping away, replaced by a compulsion to move toward the creature, to follow it into the darkness. Andrea's scream broke through the fog. She was backed against the wall, another pale figure advancing on her. I forced myself to move, fighting against the pull of the hum. I activated all the acoustic deterrents at once, creating a cacophony of sound that filled the chamber. The creatures recoiled, their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. It was working, at least temporarily. I grabbed Rusty, who was conscious but dazed, and pushed Andrea toward the exit tunnel. "Go!" I shouted over the noise of the deterrents. "I'll hold them off." She hesitated, but then nodded, taking Rusty and retreating into the tunnel. I faced the creatures, keeping the deterrents between us. They circled warily, their movements becoming more confident as they adjusted to the sound. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. The deterrents had limited battery life, and once they failed, I'd be defenseless against the hum. I backed toward the tunnel, keeping my eyes on the creatures. They didn't follow, but I could feel their attention, their hunger, as I squeezed back into the narrow passage. Andrea and Rusty were waiting for me at the other end. Rusty limped over to me, whining softly. I checked him quickly, bruised but not broken. We hurried back to the surface, not speaking until we reached the safety of daylight. "What do we do now?" Andrea asked, her voice shaky. "We can't just leave them down there?" I looked back at the cave entrance, feeling the weight of what we'd discovered. "No, we can't, but we need a better plan and more help." 2 days later, Franklin arrived from Kentucky, looking tired but determined. He'd brought with him a physicist named Dr. Simon Chen, who specialized in acoustics and vibration. "I thought you said you were done with caves," I said to Franklin as we sat in Andrea's office, going over the maps of Carlsbad. "I am," he replied grimly, "but I'm not done with those things. Not after what they did to Tanya and the others." Dr. Chen spread out his notes on the table. "Based on what you've told me, these creatures use infrasound, frequencies below the range of human hearing, to communicate and to affect human neural patterns. It's similar to what some predatory animals use to paralyze their prey, but much more sophisticated." "Can we block it?" I asked. "Not entirely," Chen admitted, "but I've been working on devices that might disrupt it more effectively than your acoustic deterrents. The problem is range. We'd need to plant them throughout the cave system to create a comprehensive barrier." I nodded, understanding what that meant. We'd have to go back down there, deeper this time, to map out the creature's territory and place Chen's devices. Andrea had arranged for the caves to be closed to tourists temporarily, citing urgent maintenance. It wouldn't keep them sealed for long, but it gave us a window to work with. We spent the next day preparing. Chen modified his devices, making them waterproof and extending their battery life. Franklin and I went over the maps, identifying potential access points the creatures might be using. Rusty's leg was still sore, but he refused to stay behind. When I tried to leave him at the ranger station, he howled so loudly that Andrea's colleagues came running. In the end, I relented. He'd proven his worth too many times to be left behind now. The four of us entered the caves early the next morning, heavily equipped with lights, Chen's anti-infrasound devices, and emergency extraction gear. I also brought explosives, just in case we needed to seal passages like we had at Mammoth. This time we bypassed the tourist sections entirely, heading straight for the newly discovered tunnel. The entrance was as narrow and uninviting as before, but beyond it something had changed. The small chamber where we'd encountered the creatures was now partially flooded, water reaching up to our knees. "They're adapting the environment," Chen murmured, testing the water with a portable sensor. "The chemical composition is unusual, high in minerals that would accelerate erosion." "They're creating more passages," I realized, expanding their territory. We placed the first of Chen's devices in the chamber, anchoring it to the wall above the waterline. It hummed to life, emitting a complex pattern of sounds designed to interfere with the creature's infrasound. "This will buy us some time," Chen said, "but we need to find their main habitat, the source of the infestation." We chose the largest of the tunnels leading from the chamber, following it deeper into the cave system. The passage sloped downward, the water getting deeper with every step. Soon we were wading waist-deep, our lights creating eerie patterns on the surface. Rusty swam beside me, his eyes alert despite his injury. Franklin and Andrea followed close behind, while Chen brought up the rear, monitoring his equipment. The tunnel eventually opened into a vast underground lake, the ceiling so high that our lights couldn't reach it. The water was clear but dark, seemingly bottomless. On the far side, I could make out what looked like structures, not natural formations, but something built by intelligent hands. "My God," Franklin whispered, "it's a city." He was right. As we moved closer, skirting the edge of the lake, the structures became clearer. Buildings carved from the living rock, twisted and organic in design, rising from the water like the skeletons of great beasts. "These weren't made by human hands," Andrea said, her voice hushed with awe and fear. Chen scanned the structures with his equipment. "The infrasound is strongest here, but it's different. More complex, like a language." We placed more of Chen's devices around the perimeter of the lake, creating a barrier that would hopefully disrupt the creature's communication. But I knew it was only a temporary solution. There were too many tunnels, too many ways for them to spread. As we worked, I felt a familiar sensation, a pressure building in my ears. The hum was returning, but subtly, working its way around Chen's defenses. "They know we're here," I warned the others. "We need to move faster." We were placing the last device when Rusty started growling, his eyes fixed on the center of the lake. The water's surface began to ripple, disturbed by something large moving beneath it. "Get back to the tunnel," I ordered, drawing my knife. "I'll finish here." The others retreated, all except Franklin, who stood his ground beside me. "Not a chance, Dan. We finish this together." The water erupted as multiple pale figures emerged, their bioluminescent markings glowing brightly in the darkness. They were larger than the ones we'd seen before, their limbs longer, their movements more deliberate. And they weren't alone. Behind them, something else rose from the depths, something massive. It looked like the others, but was easily 3 times their size, its translucent skin revealing a complex internal structure that pulsed with light. Its head was elongated, crowned with what looked like bony protrusions, and where its face should have been, there was only a smooth, reflective surface that somehow still gave the impression of watching us. The hum intensified, becoming almost unbearable. I felt my knees buckle, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. Beside me, Franklin staggered, dropping his light. Only Rusty seemed unaffected, barking furiously at the approaching creatures. Through the fog in my mind, I heard Chen shouting from the tunnel entrance. "The central device! Activate the central device!" I fumbled for the control unit, my fingers numb and clumsy. The creatures were closing in, gliding through the water with terrible grace. The larger one, the leader, extended a hand toward me, its elongated fingers almost gentle. Images flashed through my mind, not my own memories, but something alien, incomprehensible. Vast, lightless oceans beneath the earth. Civilizations rising and falling in the darkness. A patient, ancient hunger. With the last of my strength, I activated the central device. It emitted a pulse of sound that I felt rather than heard. A wave of force that rippled through the water and the air. The creatures recoiled, their movements becoming erratic. The larger one released a sound that was part screech, part moan, a noise of pain and rage that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The caves trembled, rocks falling from the ceiling as the creature's distress translated into physical force. I grabbed Franklin, who was still dazed, and dragged him toward the tunnel. Rusty led the way, limping but determined. Behind us, the city was collapsing, the strange structures crumbling into the lake. The creatures were in disarray, some fleeing into the depths, others thrashing in apparent agony. We reached the tunnel just as the ceiling of the great chamber gave way, massive chunks of rock plunging into the lake. The resulting wave nearly knocked us off our feet, but we pushed on, splashing through the increasingly turbulent water. Chen, Andrea and the others were waiting at the entrance to the narrow passage, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" Andrea asked as we squeezed through. "We hurt them," I said, gasping for breath. "But I don't think we killed them. Not all of them." The journey back to the surface was a blur of dark passages and echoing sounds. The caves were still trembling, the creature's distress sending shockwaves through the rock. When we finally emerged into daylight, the ground was still shaking beneath our feet. Park visitors and staff had evacuated, gathering in the parking lot, staring in confusion at the plumes of dust rising from the cave entrances. I looked at Franklin, at Chen and Andrea, at Rusty sitting wearily at my feet. We'd survived, but at what cost? "It's not over," Franklin said quietly, following my gaze. "Not by a long shot." I nodded, knowing he was right. We'd dealt a blow to the creatures, but there were other caves, other underground lakes and rivers where they might have spread. Our fight was just beginning. 3 months later, I stood at the entrance to Wind Cave in South Dakota, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. Rusty sat beside me, his leg fully healed now, his ears perked toward the coming storm. The pale swimmers thrived in flooded conditions, and the forecast called for record rainfall. Franklin approached, zipping up his weatherproof jacket. "Chen's team is set up in the main chamber. They've installed the new infrasound barriers throughout the accessible parts of the cave." I nodded, feeling the familiar knot of tension in my stomach. Since Carlsbad, we'd formed a small, unofficial team dedicated to tracking and containing the pale swimmers. Chen had refined his devices, creating more powerful versions that could disrupt the creature's communication over larger areas. Andrea coordinated with park services across the country, identifying potential infection sites based on reports of unusual activity, or unexplained disappearances. We'd had successes, 2 minor infestations contained before they could spread, but also failures. A spelunking team in Virginia had vanished entirely, and by the time we arrived, the caves were empty, except for scattered equipment and those distinctive petroglyphs carved freshly into the walls. "You still having the dreams?" Franklin asked quietly. I shrugged, not wanting to discuss it. Since Carlsbad, my sleep had been haunted by visions that weren't quite my own. Glimpses of vast, lightless spaces, of cities carved from living rock, of a history that stretched back far longer than human civilization. Sometimes I heard voices in those dreams, whispering in a language I almost understood. Chen believed that the contact with the pale swimmer's leader had established some kind of psychic link. "They use infrasound to rewrite neural pathways," he'd explained. "It's possible that some of that connection remains, like a radio receiver that's still picking up faint signals." Whatever the explanation, the dreams had led us here, to Wind Cave. I'd seen this place in my sleep, the distinctive boxwork formations covering the ceilings, the narrow passages opening into vast chambers. And deeper, in areas no human had explored, I'd glimpsed something waiting. "We should get inside before the storm hits," I said, checking my equipment one last time. The cave entrance was busy with Chen's team setting up monitoring equipment. They nodded to us as we passed, their faces serious and focused. Everyone knew what was at stake. Chen met us in the main chamber, his laptop displaying real-time data from the sensors placed throughout the cave. "The barriers are holding," he reported. "No sign of infrasound activity yet, but that could change when the flooding starts." I studied the map of the cave system displayed on another screen. Wind Cave was one of the most complex in the world, with over 140 miles of explored passages, and probably many more still undiscovered. The perfect hiding place for the pale swimmers. "We'll set up additional barriers here and here," I said, pointing to 2 deep sections of the cave. "And I want monitoring stations in these chambers. If anything moves down there, I want to know about it." The work was methodical, precise. We'd learned from our previous encounters, developed protocols for dealing with the creatures. No one went anywhere alone. Regular infrasound sweeps to detect any change in patterns. Emergency extraction routes mapped and memorized. As we worked, the storm arrived, rain pounding on the ground above us. We could hear it through the natural entrances, a distant roar that grew steadily louder. The cave atmosphere changed subtly, growing more humid as water began to seep through the rock. First signs of flooding in the lower levels, one of Chen's assistants reported, monitoring the sensors. Water levels rising in the lakes. I checked the main display. No unusual infrasound patterns yet, but I could feel it, an almost imperceptible vibration in the air. My dreams had been right. They were here. "Dan," Franklin called from one of the side passages. "You need to see this." I followed him down a narrow tunnel that opened into a small chamber we'd been using for storage. The equipment had been moved aside, and there, freshly carved into the wall, were the familiar petroglyphs. Elongated figures with no faces, gathered around a central figure that seemed to be reaching out. "This wasn't here an hour ago," Franklin said quietly. "I was in here setting up supplies, and the wall was bare." I stared at the carvings, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. They're already inside the barriers. We returned to the main chamber, reported what we'd found. Chen immediately adjusted the infrasound barriers, strengthening them around our position. "If they've bypassed the outer defenses, they must have found another way in," he said grimly. "A passage we don't know about." I thought of my dreams, of the glimpses I'd had of this place. "There's a chamber," I said slowly, trying to recall the details. "Deep, below the known sections. It connects to an underground river." Chen looked at me skeptically. "There's no record of such a chamber on any of the maps." "It's there," I insisted. "I've seen it." Franklin touched my arm, concerned. "Dan, if this is from your dreams..." "It's real," I said firmly. "And it's where they're coming from." In the end, they agreed to let me lead a small team to look for the chamber. Franklin, of course, insisted on coming, as did one of Chen's assistants, a young woman named Maya, who specialized in mapping complex cave systems. Rusty padded along beside us, his claws clicking on the stone floor. We descended deeper into the cave, following my instincts more than any map. The passages grew narrower, less traveled, until we were squeezing through cracks barely wide enough for a person. The air grew colder, damper as we moved away from the tourist sections. "We're off the mapped area now," Maya said, checking her equipment. "I'm laying digital markers so we can find our way back." I nodded, though I didn't need markers. Something was pulling me forward, a certainty that grew stronger with each step. Whether it was the remnants of the psychic link or something else I couldn't say, but I knew we were heading in the right direction. The passage eventually opened into a large chamber with a high, domed ceiling. Unlike the rest of the cave, this space was smooth, almost polished, as if it had been deliberately shaped. The floor sloped downward toward the center, where a pool of black water reflected our lights like a mirror. "This is it," I whispered. "This is what I saw in my dreams." Maya scanned the chamber with her equipment. "There's an opening at the bottom of the pool," she reported. "It leads to a larger body of water, possibly the underground river you mentioned." Franklin knelt by the edge of the pool, testing the water with a sensor. "The same chemical composition as at Carlsbad," he confirmed. "They've been here." I stared into the dark water, feeling the pull stronger than ever. It wanted me to enter, to descend into those lightless depths. The others were setting up monitoring equipment around the chamber, but their voices seemed distant, muffled. Rusty whined softly, pressing against my leg. His warmth brought me back to myself, breaking the trance. "We need to set up barriers here," I said, forcing myself to focus. "This is their entry point." We placed Chen's devices around the pool, creating a perimeter that would hopefully prevent anything from emerging. But as we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was aware of our presence and our efforts. "Dan," Maya called, pointing to her scanner. "There's movement in the water." I looked at the readout. Multiple signatures moving fast, approaching the surface of the pool. "Get back," I ordered. "Everyone out of the chamber now." We retreated to the entrance passage, watching as the water began to ripple. The infrasound barriers activated automatically, filling the air with their protective vibrations. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water exploded upward as pale shapes erupted from the pool. They were different from the ones we'd encountered before, their bodies more elongated, their movements more fluid. They flowed across the chamber floor like living water, their bioluminescent markings pulsing rapidly. The barriers held them back, creating an invisible wall they couldn't cross. They circled the perimeter, testing it, searching for weaknesses. Then, as one, they turned toward us, their featureless faces somehow conveying intense focus. The hum began, subtle at first, but growing rapidly in strength. It pushed against the barriers, probing, adapting. I could feel it in my mind, trying to reconnect, to re-establish the link. I resisted, focusing on the solid rock beneath my feet, on Rusty's warm presence beside me. "The barriers are holding," Maya reported, monitoring the readouts. "But they're putting out more energy than we've seen before. They're evolving." I watched the creatures moving, their patterns becoming more complex, more coordinated. They were intelligent, adaptable, and they were learning our tactics. "We need to seal this chamber," I decided. "Permanently." Franklin looked at me, understanding immediately. "Explosives?" I nodded. "Set charges around the entrance. We'll collapse the passage." While Maya maintained the barriers, Franklin and I prepared the explosives. The creatures watched us work, their attention never wavering. The hum continued, changing frequency, searching for a way through our defenses. As we placed the last charge, I felt something change in the atmosphere of the chamber. The water in the pool began to churn, driven by something large moving beneath the surface. The pale creatures retreated, clearing a path from the pool to the barrier. A massive shape rose from the water, similar to the leader we'd encountered at Carlsbad, but somehow different. Its body was more defined, its movements more precise. And its face, while still lacking features, seemed to hold an expression, something like recognition. It approached the barrier slowly, deliberately, and placed a long-fingered hand against the invisible wall. The hum intensified, focused entirely on me. Images flooded my mind, clearer than before, more structured. I saw cities beneath the earth, vast civilizations that had never seen the sun. I saw the pale swimmers evolving, adapting to a world of darkness and pressure. And I saw them watching us, studying humanity from the shadows, learning our languages, our technologies, our weaknesses. They were not mindless predators, but an ancient species that had shared the planet with us for millennia, remaining hidden, observing. Until now. The creature withdrew its hand, and the images faded. The hum changed again, becoming almost questioning. "Dan?" Franklin's voice seemed to come from far away. "Dan, we need to go. The charges are set." I blinked, forcing myself back to reality. The creature was still watching me, waiting. I had the strangest feeling that it was offering something, a choice or a warning. "What do they want?" I asked aloud, though I wasn't sure who I was asking. The creature tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I understood. They wanted what all living things want, to survive, to expand, to evolve. The flooding caves had given them new opportunities, new territories to explore. They weren't invading our world, we were blocking theirs. But understanding didn't mean accepting. Whatever their intentions, the pale swimmers were dangerous to humans. The missing researchers, Tanya's transformation, the whispers that drove people to madness. These weren't the actions of a benevolent species seeking coexistence. "We're leaving," I said firmly, backing toward the passage. "Set the timer for 5 minutes." Franklin nodded, programming the detonator. The creature watched us, unmoving, as we retreated into the narrow tunnel. Maya went first, then Franklin. I lingered a moment longer, meeting the creature's gaze one last time. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure why. The creature made no response, but the hum changed again, becoming almost resigned. I turned and followed the others, Rusty at my heels. We moved quickly through the narrow passages, retracing our steps toward the main chamber. Behind us the hum faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the cave, dripping water, distant echoes, our own breathing. We had just reached the main chamber when the explosion shook the cave, the sound reverberating through the stone. Dust filled the air, and small rocks rained down from the ceiling. Then silence. Chen rushed over, his face concerned. "What happened? The sensors are going crazy." "We found them," I said simply, "and we sealed them in." Later, as the storm raged above us and the waters continued to rise in the lower levels of the cave, I sat alone in a quiet corner. Rusty's head resting on my lap. The visions from the creature still lingered in my mind, fragments of an alien perspective that I couldn't fully comprehend. Franklin found me there, offering a cup of coffee. "The barriers are holding," he reported. "No sign of activity from the sealed chamber." I nodded, grateful for his presence. "Do you think we did the right thing?" He considered the question seriously. "I don't know if there is a right thing in this situation. They're not like us, Dan. Their world and ours, they're not meant to intersect. But they have," I pointed out, "and they will again. This isn't over." Franklin sighed, looking older than his years. "No, I suppose it isn't." We sat in companionable silence, listening to the distant sound of the storm. The pale swimmers would find other ways out, other caves to explore, and we would be there to meet them, to maintain the boundary between their world and ours. I thought of Tanya, wondered if she was still alive somewhere in those lightless depths, transformed into something no longer human. I thought of the missing researchers, of all the people who had vanished into the darkness over the centuries. And I thought of the creatures themselves, ancient and patient, watching us from the shadows. We had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. A war fought not with weapons, but with understanding, with boundaries, with respect for the unknown. As I dozed off, exhausted from the day's events, I heard the whispers again, faint but persistent. They would always be there now, an echo of that other world that existed alongside our own, separated by only the thinnest of barriers. In my dreams, I saw the caves stretching on forever, a vast network beneath the earth, home to wonders and terrors we could scarcely imagine. And somewhere in that darkness, the pale swimmers waited, evolving, adapting, preparing for our next encounter. The caves had always been their domain. We were just visitors, temporary intruders in a world far older and stranger than we could comprehend. And deep down, I knew I would return to those depths, drawn by the whispers and the mysteries they held. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. The pale swimmers would be waiting. The first thing they teach you in ranger training is that the wilderness doesn't care if you live or die. I remember the exact moment I decided to become a park ranger. I was 10 years old, lost in the Cascades with my father. 3 days into what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, we'd wandered off trail, chasing what Dad swore was a shortcut back to the ranger station. The fog had rolled in thick as wool, swallowing the landmarks we'd carefully memorized. By nightfall, we were shivering under a makeshift shelter of pine branches, our water nearly gone. On the morning of the fourth day, just as panic was beginning to set in, a figure emerged from the mist. Tall and steady, wearing that iconic flat-topped hat, Ranger Miyawaki found us with a calm efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. She didn't lecture or scold. She simply led us back to safety with quiet authority, pointing out landmarks and teaching me how to read the forest as we walked. By the time we reached the station, I knew exactly what I wanted to be when I grew up. 20 years later, I stood at the edge of Timber Shadow National Forest, my own ranger hat firmly in place, staring up at the ancient pines that clawed at the sky like gnarled fingers. The posting wasn't prestigious, a remote outpost in the northernmost region of the park, far from the tourist trails and scenic viewpoints. But it was mine. "Ranger Atakai," I said aloud, testing the sound of my title alongside the name my Navajo grandmother had given me. Atakai, light upon the mountain. She'd be proud, I thought, though she'd also warn me about wandering too deep into places where old spirits dwell. My cabin stood at the edge of Obsidian Lake, a perfect mirror of black water ringed by towering pines. The structure itself was rustic but solid. One main room with a wood stove, a small bedroom, and a basic bathroom with surprisingly decent water pressure. Solar panels on the roof provided enough electricity for essentials, and a satellite phone offered my only reliable connection to the outside world. Cell service was a fantasy up here, 40 miles from the nearest town of Pine Hollow. I spent my first week settling in, organizing equipment, and familiarizing myself with the territory. My responsibilities were straightforward: patrol designated areas, assist lost hikers, enforce conservation regulations, monitor wildlife activity, and maintain trails. It was early May, and the tourist season wouldn't hit its peak until July, which gave me time to learn the lay of the land. On my first solo patrol, I hiked 8 miles along the western ridge, making notes of trail conditions and fallen trees that would need clearing. The forest was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no scurrying creatures, just the occasional whisper of wind through the pines. I told myself it was normal for this time of year, but something about the silence made the hair on my neck stand up. I was marking my map when I heard it, a crack of a branch breaking somewhere behind me, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps. I turned slowly, hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt. "Hello?" I called out, voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of my pulse. "This is a ranger Atakai. If you're a hiker, please identify yourself." Nothing. Just more silence, heavier now. I scanned the tree line, seeing nothing unusual among the dense pines. Then I spotted it, about 50 yards back, partially obscured by a massive Douglas fir. Something large moved in a slow, deliberate way that was neither human nor typical wildlife. It was tall, far taller than a person, with what appeared to be dark, matted fur. My training kicked in. I knew the region had black bears, though they rarely approached humans unless provoked or habituated to human food. This wasn't bear behavior. Bears don't hide behind trees watching you. They either run away or, if threatened, become aggressive. "Hey!" I shouted firmly, making myself sound bigger. "Move along now." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the figure shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something that sent ice through my veins. Not the gleam of animal eyes, but something eerily close to human awareness in a face that absolutely was not human. Then it was gone, melting into the forest with surprising grace for something so large. I stood frozen, trying to process what I'd seen. In the Pacific Northwest, tales of Sasquatch or Bigfoot have been part of the cultural landscape for generations, with indigenous peoples like the Sensales Nation having traditional stories of wild men living in the mountains. But like most scientifically trained people, I'd always considered these stories to be a blend of misidentification, folklore, and the occasional hoax. Now, standing alone in the silent forest, I wasn't so sure. I marked the location on my GPS and continued my patrol, hyper-aware of every sound and movement around me. By the time I returned to my cabin, darkness was falling, and I was exhausted, not just physically, but from the constant vigilance that had accompanied me since the encounter. Inside, I uploaded my patrol notes to the park database, including a careful description of what I'd seen, classified as possible wildlife sighting, unidentified large mammal. I knew how it would sound if I suggested anything else. New rangers who report Bigfoot sightings don't tend to be taken seriously by management. That night, I dreamed of being watched from the tree line, of eyes that understood too much. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of something heavy moving around the perimeter of my cabin. When I worked up the courage to peek through the window, the full moon illuminated only the usual scene. My Jeep parked to the side, the lake shimmering beyond, the forest a wall of shadows. But in the soft dirt near my front steps, clearly visible in the moonlight, was a single footprint nearly twice the size of my boot. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a bear print, distorted by poor light and an anxious mind. When I went outside to check, it was gone, erased by the light rain that had fallen before dawn. My second week passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine, met a few of the early season hikers, and checked in with headquarters twice via the satellite phone. My direct supervisor, Regional Manager Hoffman, seemed pleased with my reports but reminded me that unusual animal sightings should be documented with photographic evidence whenever possible. "The department's been dealing with some strange reports from your sector over the years," he said, his voice crackling through the poor connection. "Nothing concrete, but enough to make us curious. If you see anything worth noting, make sure you get it on camera." I promised I would, though I didn't mention my first week encounter. Something told me to wait until I had more than just a glimpse and a feeling of wrongness to report. It was during my third week that I found the first true anomaly. I was mapping a lesser-used trail that wound toward the northern boundary of my territory when I spotted what looked like a structure through the trees. Curious, I left the trail, pushing through dense underbrush until I reached a small clearing. In the center stood a crude shelter made of broken branches and bark, woven together with surprising skill. It wasn't the work of casual campers, it was too intricate, too deliberately constructed. Yet it also wasn't the product of modern tools. The branches had been broken, not cut, and the weaving pattern was unlike anything I'd seen in survival manuals. Inside the shelter were strange arrangements of stones and bones, small animal remains carefully positioned in patterns that seemed deliberate but incomprehensible. My first thought was that I'd stumbled upon some kind of ritualistic site, perhaps used by locals or even cult activities. I took photos, careful not to disturb anything, and marked the location for further investigation. As I turned to leave, I noticed something scratched into the bark of a nearby pine. Not letters or numbers, but a series of vertical lines grouped in clusters of 5. Counting marks, perhaps? I photographed these, too, feeling increasingly uneasy. The sound came just as I was putting my camera away, a low, resonant call that was neither animal nor human, echoing through the trees. It had a quality that made my skin crawl, a sound that didn't belong in these woods or perhaps anywhere on Earth. I'd heard tales of alleged Bigfoot vocalizations, howls, screams, and whistles that witnesses claimed were distinct from known wildlife. But this was something else entirely. This was communication. I left quickly, keeping to established trails, feeling watched with every step. That night, I sent the photos to headquarters with a detailed report, careful to present the findings objectively without speculation. Within an hour, my satellite phone rang. "Atakai, this is Director Reyes." The voice was clipped, authoritative. As the overall director of park operations, Reyes rarely communicated directly with field rangers. "I need you to stay away from that site. We're sending a research team up next week. Until then, stick to your regular patrols and standard duties. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," I replied, surprised by the urgency in his tone. "May I ask what—" "Just maintain your regular schedule, Ranger. We'll discuss it when the team arrives." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat staring at the phone, mind racing with questions. Why would a shelter in the woods warrant such immediate attention from the director himself? What wasn't he telling me? 3 days later, I received my first visitors. A battered pickup truck pulled up to my cabin just after midday. Australian license plates caked with mud from the forest roads. 2 people emerged. A tall man with a sun-weathered face and a woman with bright red hair tied back in a practical braid. "G'day," the man called out, striding toward me with an easy confidence. "You must be Ranger Atakai. I'm Dr. Jack Thornton, and this is my colleague, Dr. Lindsay Walsh. We're wildlife biologists from the University of Melbourne, here on an exchange program." I shook their hands, noting the firmness of their grips and the keen assessment in their eyes. "Welcome to Timber Shadow. What brings you to my particular corner of the wilderness?" They exchanged a quick glance before Lindsay answered. "We're conducting research on apex predator territories in temperate rainforests across different continents. Your region has some interesting patterns we'd like to study." It sounded reasonable enough, but something about their arrival so soon after my discovery felt too coincidental. Still, I played along. "Well, I'm happy to help however I can. There's a research station about 10 miles south with better facilities, though." "We prefer to be closer to our study area," Jack said smoothly. "The director mentioned you might have space in your cabin for a couple of temporary guests, just for a week or so while we set up our equipment." So Reyes had sent them. Interesting. "I have a spare room. It's basic, but you're welcome to it." They retrieved their gear from the truck, an impressive array of cameras, tracking equipment, and what looked like specialized recording devices. As they settled in, I observed them carefully. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to field work, but there was an underlying tension in their interactions, a sense of urgency that belied their casual explanation. That evening, over a dinner of pasta and canned sauce, I decided to probe a little. "So, what specific animals are you tracking? Bears? Wolves?" Lindsay took a sip of her water before answering. We're interested in unusual wildlife reports, actually. Anything that doesn't quite fit the expected ecosystem. Unusual like what? Jack leaned forward. Timber Shadow has a higher than average number of unexplained wildlife encounters. We're documenting patterns, trying to determine if there's a previously unclassified predator in these forests. You mean like a new species? I asked, keeping my expression neutral. Maybe, Lindsay said, studying my reaction. Or perhaps a known species exhibiting unusual behavior. Either way, it's worth investigating scientifically. I thought about the shelter in the woods, the strange markings, the sound that had chilled me to the bone. And what does Director Reyes think about your research? Another glance between them before Jack answered. He's supportive. The Park Service always values good science. I nodded slowly. You know, I found something interesting on patrol last week. A shelter in the north sector that didn't look like standard human camping. Their casual demeanor slipped for just a moment, a flash of intensity that confirmed my suspicions. These weren't just random researchers. We'd love to see it, Lindsay said too quickly. Perhaps you could take us there tomorrow. I was instructed to avoid the area until a research team arrived, I replied, watching their reactions closely. I assume that's you? Jack's laugh was forced. Sounds like it. Yes, we're particularly interested in that site. The director shared your photos. I decided to push a little further. Have you ever heard something in the woods that you couldn't identify? A call or a cry that didn't match any known animal? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken knowledge. Finally, Lindsay nodded. That's actually a specialty of mine, bioacoustics. I analyze animal vocalizations. Some of the sounds recorded in these forests are unusual. And you think they're connected to whatever made that shelter? Jack's expression turned serious. We don't know yet. That's why we're here. The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, but I'd learned enough to know they weren't telling me everything. As they retired to the spare room for the night, I heard them talking in low, urgent tones. I caught fragments, similar to the Quebec site and DNA samples, before their voices became too quiet to distinguish. That night, I dreamed again of being watched, but this time the eyes in the darkness were joined by a presence that seemed to reach into my mind, probing with cold curiosity. I woke, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat despite the cool mountain air. Outside my window, the forest loomed black against the night sky. For a moment I thought I saw a massive silhouette moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Then it was gone, leaving only questions and a growing sense that I was caught in the middle of something much larger and stranger than I'd ever imagined. Tomorrow, I would take my Australian visitors to the shelter. And somehow, I knew that whatever waited for us there would change everything. Dawn broke with an unnatural stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that pressed against the cabin like a physical weight. I found Jack and Lindsay already awake, huddled over a topographical map of the region, marking coordinates with practiced precision. Early risers, I commented, putting coffee on to brew. Lindsay looked up, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept much. We're used to field schedules. The animals don't wait for a reasonable hour. Speaking of animals, Jack said, folding the map, we heard something circling the cabin last night, heavy footsteps moving with purpose. Any idea what it might have been? I hesitated, remembering the silhouette I'd glimpsed outside my window. Could have been a black bear. They sometimes get curious about human dwellings. This didn't move like a bear, Lindsay said quietly. Too bipedal, too deliberate. Our eyes met in a moment of shared understanding. We all knew what we were really discussing, even if none of us was ready to name it aloud. After a quick breakfast, we loaded our gear into my Jeep and set out for the northern sector. The forest felt different in the morning light. Less menacing, perhaps, but no less watchful. As a wilderness ranger, I'd learned to be self-reliant when working in remote areas, to understand natural hazards and mitigate risks, skills essential for survival in these isolated environments. But nothing in my training had prepared me for what we found when we reached the clearing. The shelter was gone, not damaged or collapsed, completely erased. Where the intricate structure had stood, there was only undisturbed forest floor, as if nothing had ever been there. I double-checked my GPS coordinates, confirmed we were in the right location, and showed Jack and Lindsay the photos I'd taken. "This makes no sense," I said, scanning the clearing. "It was right here, solidly built, couldn't have blown away." Jack knelt, examining the ground with a forensic intensity. No drag marks, no footprints, no sign it was dismantled. He looked up at me. "Are you absolutely certain this is the right place?" I handed him my GPS unit. "Check for yourself. These are the exact coordinates I recorded." Lindsay had wandered to the edge of the clearing, studying the pine tree where I'd seen the strange markings. "The carvings are gone too," she called back. "But look at this." We joined her at the tree. The bark where the markings had been was fresher, lighter in color, recently regrown somehow, though that should have been impossible in just a few days. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered, touching the smooth new bark. Lindsay pulled a small device from her pack and held it up to the tree. It emitted a soft whirring sound, and a display lit up with readings I couldn't interpret. "Elevated EMF," she said to Jack. "Similar to the Montreal site." "EMF?" I asked. "Electromagnetic frequency," Jack explained, though his tone suggested he was simplifying greatly. "Sometimes associated with unusual phenomena." Lindsay was taking samples now, bark scrapings, soil from the base of the tree, even air samples in specialized containers. Jack photographed the entire clearing from multiple angles, paying particular attention to the spaces between trees, as if measuring distances. "You've seen this before," I said. It wasn't a question. They exchanged another of their significant glances before Lindsay nodded. "Similar cases, yes. The shelter appears briefly, then vanishes without a trace. The locals attribute it to Bigfoot," Jack finished, watching for my reaction, "or whatever name the indigenous culture in the area uses for the forest beings." I thought of my grandmother's stories about the ancient ones who walked between the worlds of humans and spirits. My Navajo family would call them Yaitso, the big giants. "Every culture has them," Lindsay said. "Sasquatch, Yeti, Yowie in Australia, Almasty in Russia. The details differ, but the core description remains remarkably consistent." "But those are just stories," I insisted, even as my mind flashed back to the figure I'd glimpsed in the woods. The footprint outside my cabin, the strange calls in the night. Jack's expression was grave. "What if they're not? What if there's something real behind all those stories, something that exists at the edge of human experience?" Before I could respond, a tremendous crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a massive tree falling somewhere nearby. The ground trembled beneath our feet. "That came from the east," I said, immediately alert. "About half a mile, I'd guess." Without discussion, we moved in that direction, weaving through the dense underbrush with as much speed as we could manage. Jack and Lindsay followed my lead, their movements surprisingly agile for academic researchers. The scene we discovered was bizarre enough to stop us in our tracks. A massive Douglas fir, at least 100 years old, lay splintered on the forest floor. But it hadn't fallen naturally. It had been systematically broken at about 10 feet up the trunk, the wood torn and twisted rather than cleanly cut. Around the fallen giant was a circle of smaller trees, all bent inward at impossible angles, their trunks curved but unbroken. "My God," Lindsay whispered, raising her camera to document the scene. Jack circled the fallen tree, examining the splintered break. No human could have done this, not without heavy equipment, and there are no vehicle tracks. I approached the break point, examining the torn wood fibers. No saw marks, no rope burns. It's like it was twisted down. "It would take tremendous strength," Jack agreed. "More than any known animal possesses." A shiver ran through me as I realized something else. "Look at the pattern," I said, gesturing to the circle of bent trees. "It's deliberate. Someone, or something, created this." Lindsay was busy taking more readings with her devices, her expression growing increasingly perplexed. "The electromagnetic anomalies are off the charts here. This isn't natural." As we documented the site, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Several times I caught glimpses of movement at the corner of my vision, only to find nothing when I turned to look directly. A phenomenon reported by other rangers in similar remote situations. "Do you feel that?" I asked quietly. Jack nodded without looking up from his work. We're being watched. Lindsay had frozen, her hand hovering over her sample kit. There's something behind that ridge, she whispered, nodding toward a small rise about 30 yards away. We all turned slowly. At first I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved, a massive dark figure partially obscured by the trees. It stood upright, impossibly tall, watching us with an intelligence that seemed to radiate across the clearing. Don't move, Jack breathed. Lindsay, camera, slowly. She raised her camera with deliberate care, but before she could focus, a sound cut through the forest. That same unnatural call I'd heard days earlier, but louder now, more complex, almost like language. The hair on my arm stood on end as the call was answered by another, then another, from different directions around us. We're surrounded, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. The figure on the ridge shifted, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I clearly saw a face, not quite human, not quite animal, with deep-set eyes that held an ancient wisdom. Then it melted back into the forest with that same fluid grace I'd observed before. Did you get it? Jack asked urgently. Lindsay checked her camera, her hands trembling slightly. Just a blur. It moved too fast. Another call echoed through the trees, closer now. The message was unmistakable, even if the language was incomprehensible. This is our territory. You are intruders. We need to leave, I said, already backing toward the path we'd taken. Now. We retreated with measured steps, maintaining awareness in all directions. The calls continued, seemingly tracking our movement through the forest. By the time we reached the jeep, my heart was pounding, and I could see that my companions, despite their experience, were equally shaken. The drive back to the cabin passed in tense silence. Once inside, Lindsay immediately connected her camera to a laptop, while Jack spread their maps across the table, marking the locations of our encounters with precise notations. That wasn't a bear, I finally said, stating the obvious. Jack looked up, his expression grim. No, it wasn't. Then what the hell was it? Lindsay turned her laptop so we could see the screen. The image was blurry, but unmistakable. A tall, bipedal figure with broad shoulders, covered in dark fur or hair. The scientific community would call this insufficient evidence, she said. Too grainy, too ambiguous. But we've seen enough of these to recognize the pattern. You're Bigfoot researchers, I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. Not ordinary biologists. We're cryptozoologists, Jack corrected. Scientists who study animals not yet recognized by mainstream science. But we approach it with scientific rigor, not sensation-seeking. And Director Reyes knows about this? Lindsay nodded. Select officials within the Park Service work with our international research network. There's been a program in place for decades, documenting encounters like yours without alarming the public. I thought about this, processing the implications. So my finding the shelter triggered an automatic protocol, Jack confirmed. We were already in the country studying similar phenomena in Olympic National Park when Reyes contacted us. Why the secrecy? If these creatures are real, wouldn't it be better to acknowledge them openly? Protect them as an endangered species? Lindsay closed her laptop with a sigh. It's complicated. There are those who believe public confirmation would lead to a rush of thrill-seekers and poachers trying to capture or kill specimens. Others worry about the philosophical and religious implications of another intelligent hominid species. And some, Jack added darkly, are concerned about what we might discover about their true nature, because the evidence increasingly suggests they're not simply undiscovered primates. What do you mean? The electromagnetic anomalies, Lindsay explained. The structure that vanished without a trace. The ability to bend trees without breaking them. These suggest capabilities beyond normal physical limitations. I thought back to my grandmother's stories again. Beings who walked between worlds, who could appear and disappear at will, who understood more about the natural world than humans ever would. There's something else you should know, Jack said, his voice low. These encounters have been increasing across all major wilderness areas globally. It's as if they're becoming more active, more visible, and in some cases, more aggressive. I recalled reading about the Marble Mountain Wilderness encounter in Northern California, where hikers reported a massive upright figure watching them, followed by strange noises and an overwhelming feeling of being observed throughout the night. "Why now?" I asked. "We think they're responding to environmental pressures," Lindsay said. "Habitat loss, climate change, increased human encroachment on previously isolated territories." A heavy weight settled in my stomach. "Are they dangerous?" "Any cornered wild animal is dangerous," Jack replied carefully. "But these beings have avoided direct conflict with humans for centuries, despite having the physical capacity to cause significant harm. That suggests intelligence and restraint." "Until now," Lindsay added quietly. "The patterns are changing. They're becoming more territorial, more willing to make their presence known." Outside, darkness was falling rapidly. The forest beyond my windows, a wall of impenetrable shadow. The thought of spending another night in the cabin, knowing what lurked in the woods around us, sent a chill down my spine. "I have friends in town," I said suddenly. "Canadian researchers who visit every summer to study migratory birds. They have a cabin on the south shore of the lake. Maybe we should join them tonight, compare notes." Jack and Lindsay exchanged another of their meaningful glances. "Actually," Jack said slowly, "that might be an excellent idea. Not just for safety in numbers, but because we could use additional perspectives. Are they scientists?" "David's an ornithologist," I replied, already reaching for the satellite phone. "Maya's a cultural anthropologist, specializing in indigenous folklore. They might have insights we could use." The call was brief. David answered on the second ring, his voice warm with friendship despite the months since we'd last spoken. When I explained we needed a place to stay for the night, keeping the details vague, he immediately invited us over. "Bring some beer if you have it," he said cheerfully. "Maya's made her famous venison stew, and there's plenty to go around." We packed quickly, gathering essential equipment and overnight bags. I hesitated before grabbing my service weapon from its locked cabinet, a standard-issue Glock that I rarely carried on regular patrols. Tonight, however, its weight was reassuring against my hip. As we stepped outside to load the Jeep, the forest erupted with sound. A chorus of those strange calls, closer than ever before, surrounding the cabin in a cacophony that made rational thought nearly impossible. They rose and fell in complex patterns, almost like conversation or debate. "They know we're leaving," Lindsay said, her voice barely audible above the noise. Jack nodded grimly. "And they're not happy about it." We piled into the Jeep, and I started the engine, flipping on the powerful roof-mounted spotlights that illuminated the clearing. For an instant, just a fraction of a second, the beams caught multiple pairs of eyes reflecting back from the tree line. Then they were gone, blinked out like stars behind clouds. The drive to the south shore took 20 minutes, following a rough service road that hugged the edge of the lake. With each mile, the oppressive feeling of being watched gradually diminished, replaced by an almost eerie calm. By the time we pulled up to David and Maya's cabin, the forest was silent again, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Their cabin was larger than mine, with a welcoming glow of lamplight in the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. David emerged as we parked, his lanky frame silhouetted against the light from the open door. "Atakai!" he called, striding forward to envelop me in a bear hug. "Great to see you, man. And you brought friends?" I made the introductions as Maya appeared in the doorway, her dark hair streaked with premature silver that caught the light. Her greeting was warmer than David's, if possible, and within minutes we were seated around their kitchen table, bowls of fragrant stew steaming before us. "So," David said, passing a basket of fresh bread, "what brings you to our neck of the woods? Trouble at your cabin?" I glanced at Jack and Lindsay, who nodded slightly, permission to share what we'd experienced. Over the next hour, I detailed everything: the initial sighting, the shelter, the fallen tree, the watching figures, the strange calls. David and Maya listened without interruption, their expressions growing increasingly serious. When I finished, a heavy silence filled the room. David whistled softly. "Well," he said finally, "that explains a few things." "What do you mean?" Jack asked sharply. David leaned back in his chair. "We've been hearing those calls for weeks now. I assumed they were some kind of wolf variant, maybe a subspecies adapted to the local environment. Maya thought otherwise." All eyes turned to Maya, who was studying Lindsay with particular interest. "You're not just any cryptozoologists," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You're with the Interspecies Communication Initiative, aren't you?" Lindsay's surprise was evident. "How did you—" "I attended a closed anthropology symposium in Vancouver last year," Maya explained. Dr. Helena Rourke presented some fascinating findings on non-human language patterns in wilderness areas. She mentioned colleagues working on similar research across multiple continents. "Helena's our research director," Jack confirmed. "This project is her life's work." Maya nodded as if a suspicion had been confirmed. "Then you know these aren't just animals. The vocalization patterns are too complex, too structured. They're using language." "We believe so," Lindsay agreed, "though we're only beginning to understand the most basic elements." I looked between them, struggling to process this new dimension. "You're saying Bigfoot or whatever these beings are can talk?" "Not just talk," Maya said, her eyes bright with academic excitement despite the unsettling implications. "Communicate in a highly sophisticated language that likely predates human civilization. The indigenous peoples of this region have always maintained that the Sasquatch were another tribe. Not animals, but people of a different kind, with their own societies and knowledge." David had been unusually quiet, I realized, staring out the window into the darkness. "There's something else," he said finally. "Something we found yesterday that we couldn't explain." He crossed to a side table and returned with a small object wrapped in cloth. Carefully unfolding it, he revealed a stone disc about 4 inches in diameter, covered in spiraling patterns carved with remarkable precision. "We found this on our porch yesterday morning," Maya explained. "No footprints, no sign of who left it. It resembles artifacts from several indigenous cultures, but doesn't quite match any known design." Jack examined the disc with growing excitement. "This is deliberate communication, a gift or a message." Lindsay took photos while I studied the intricate patterns. Something about them seemed almost familiar, as if I should be able to read their meaning. "The timing can't be coincidental," David said. "You find a structure in the north sector, we receive this artifact in the south. They're aware of all of us, monitoring our movements throughout the park." A thought struck me. "How extensive is their territory, do you think?" Jack spread his map on the table, indicating the boundaries of the national forest. "Based on similar cases, they could control anywhere from 50 to several hundred square miles. This entire protected area could be a single clan's territory." "And we just happen to live in the middle of it," I said, the implications sinking in. Maya nodded. "Not by chance, I suspect. They allow humans they deem respectful to exist within their boundaries. Park rangers, researchers who study natural systems without causing harm. We're tolerated because we serve as unwitting guardians of their territory against wider human encroachment." "But something's changed," Lindsay added. "They're becoming more visible, more interactive. The question is why." David tapped the stone disc. "I think they're trying to tell us." The conversation continued late into the night, theories and questions flowing freely now that we'd all acknowledged the reality we were facing. Around midnight, Maya suggested we get some rest. She and David offered their guest room to Lindsay, while Jack and I would take the couch and a camping mattress in the living room. I was nearly asleep when Jack spoke from the darkness. "Adakai," he said quietly. "There's something we haven't told you, something about why the director sent us specifically." I turned to face his shadowy outline. "What is it?" "There have been disappearances. 3 hikers in Olympic National Park last month, a family in Yellowstone the month before. In each case, the pattern was the same. They vanished near structures similar to the one you found, leaving no trace except clear, oversized footprints." The weight of this revelation settled heavily on me. "You think these beings are taking people?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but the pattern suggests some kind of interaction gone wrong. The research team is trying to understand why peaceful coexistence is breaking down in certain areas. And you think it might happen here?" "We hope not," Jack said, "but yes, it's possible. Which is why we need to understand what they're trying to communicate before things escalate further." I lay awake long after Jack's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, my mind racing with implications. If Jack was right, we weren't just observers of an extraordinary phenomenon. We were potentially in danger from creatures powerful enough to tear down ancient trees and disappear without a trace. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into uneasy dreams of stone discs spinning like galaxies, ancient eyes watching from the darkness, and voices calling in a language older than human memory. Morning brought fog rolling off the lake, shrouding the forest in ghostly white. We gathered around the kitchen table, comparing notes and planning our next steps over strong coffee and Maya's homemade cinnamon rolls. "I think we need to go back to the north sector," Jack said. "The tree formation is significant. It could be a boundary marker or warning." Lindsay nodded. "And we should bring recording equipment. If they're vocalizing more frequently, we might capture enough data to begin basic language analysis." "I'm coming with you," Maya said firmly. "My background in anthropological linguistics could help interpret any patterns we discover." "Me too," David added. "Safety in numbers, and I'm not letting Maya go without me." I considered our options. We should take both vehicles. That way, if anything happens, we have backup transportation. The plan settled, we gathered our equipment, cameras, recording devices, sample kits, GPS units, and emergency supplies. I made sure everyone had bear spray, though I doubted its effectiveness against what we were potentially facing. My service weapon remained holstered at my hip, a last resort I hoped never to use. As we prepared to leave, Maya pulled me aside, her expression troubled. "Adakai, there's something you should know about these encounters," she said quietly. "In almost every indigenous tradition, these beings exist at the boundary between worlds. They're not just flesh and blood. They're connected to the spirit realm in ways we don't understand." I thought of my grandmother again, her stories by firelight about beings who could shift between forms, who guarded ancient knowledge. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to approach this with respect and openness," she replied. "If they're trying to communicate, there's a reason. And if we can understand that reason, we might prevent whatever conflict is brewing." I nodded, appreciating her perspective, even as questions multiplied in my mind. As we loaded the vehicles, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a threshold, moving from observers to participants in something ancient and powerful that had been unfolding in these forests long before humans built cabins on its shores. Whatever waited for us in the northern sector, I knew with bone-deep certainty that after today, nothing would be the same. Chapter 3. Forest Depths. The fog clung to the treetops as our small convoy traveled north, transforming the familiar forest into an alien landscape. I led in my Jeep with Jack beside me, while David drove their SUV behind us with Maya and Lindsay. The two-way radios we carried crackled occasionally with updates, but mostly we drove in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we approached the area where we'd seen the fallen tree, a sense of wrongness grew within me, something beyond mere apprehension. The forest itself seemed changed, the trees closer together, the undergrowth more tangled, as if the landscape was deliberately becoming more difficult to navigate. "The road's different," I said, slowing the Jeep. "This bend wasn't so sharp yesterday." Jack studied the GPS, frowning. "We're on the right track, but you're right. The topography seems altered somehow." I radioed back to the second vehicle. "Are you seeing this? The forest changing?" "Affirmative," came David's voice, tight with tension. "It's like we're driving through a different section entirely." We pressed on, the service road narrowing until branches scraped against the sides of our vehicles. Just as I was considering turning back to find another approach, the forest suddenly opened into a clearing, but not one I recognized from previous patrols. Before us stood an arrangement of stones, not random boulders, but carefully positioned monoliths, ranging from 3 to 8 feet tall, arranged in a rough circle about 30 yards across. In the center lay the fallen Douglas fir we'd documented the day before, but it had been moved somehow, its massive trunk now forming a straight line pointing due north. I stopped the Jeep at the edge of the clearing, and David pulled up alongside. For a long moment, we all simply stared at the impossible scene before us. "This wasn't here yesterday," I finally said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. Lindsay was already recording with her specialized equipment, while Maya photographed the stone arrangement from multiple angles. Jack and David moved toward the fallen tree, measuring instruments in hand. I stayed by the vehicles, scanning the tree line, that sense of being watched stronger than ever. The fog swirled at the edges of the clearing, creating shapes that seemed almost deliberate, faces that formed and dissolved, figures that appeared to move before resolving into ordinary mist. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," Lindsay called from where she stood by one of the larger monoliths. "This stone is emitting a frequency I've never encountered before." Maya had joined her, running her hands just above the surface of the stone without touching it. "There are markings here, similar to the disc we found but more elaborate." Jack and David had reached the fallen tree and were examining something at its base. "Attica, you need to see this," Jack shouted, his voice tight with excitement or fear. I couldn't tell which. I crossed the clearing, hyper-aware of the unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just our voices and footsteps, unnaturally loud in the stillness. At the base of the fallen giant, a section of bark had been peeled away with surgical precision, revealing the pale wood beneath. Into this canvas, someone, or something, had carved an intricate image, a circle of stylized figures surrounding a central form that could only be interpreted as human. "It's a pictograph," Maya said, having followed me over. "A form of communication that transcends language barriers." "What does it mean?" I asked, unable to take my eyes off the central human figure, which seemed somehow familiar. Maya studied it intently. The outer figures appear to be protecting or perhaps encircling the human. It could be a message about territory, boundaries, or relationships between species. "Or a warning," Jack added quietly. David was examining the tree's root system, which had somehow remained intact despite the tree being moved. "This is impossible," he muttered. "This tree weighs several tons. How did they relocate it without heavy equipment?" Before anyone could respond, the silence was shattered by a call. That same eerie vocalization we'd heard before, but closer now, and followed immediately by responses from multiple directions. "They're here," Lindsay said, her recording equipment swiveling toward the sound. We regrouped in the center of the clearing, instinctively forming a circle with our backs to each other, scanning the fog-shrouded tree line. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then, simultaneously, dark figures appeared between the monoliths, 8 of them, evenly spaced around the perimeter of the clearing. They stood upright, towering at least 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in dark hair or fur. In the diffuse fog light, their features were difficult to discern, but their eyes were clearly visible, intelligent, watching, evaluating. For centuries, tales of hairy humanoid giants have persisted across different cultures, from Native American tribes to isolated communities in the Himalayas, suggesting a global phenomenon rather than mere local folklore. Now, face to face with these beings, all scientific skepticism seemed absurd. They were real, they were here, and they had arranged this meeting with deliberate purpose. Lindsay's recording devices whirred softly as she captured their presence. Jack and David stood frozen, their academic training temporarily overwhelmed by the reality before them. Maya, however, stepped forward slightly, her hands open at her sides in a universal gesture of peaceful intent. "We acknowledge your presence," she said clearly. "We come with respect for your territory and wisdom." The figures remained motionless, but the atmosphere in the clearing changed subtly. A lessening of tension, perhaps, or a shift from wariness to curiosity. One of the beings, slightly larger than the others, and with silver streaks in its dark pelt, moved forward 3 precise steps. It raised a massive hand, palm forward, in what could only be interpreted as a greeting, or perhaps a command to halt. Without thinking, I mirrored the gesture. "We mean no harm," I said, hoping my tone would convey what my words might not. The silver-streaked being tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Then it made a series of sounds. Not the howling calls we'd heard before, but something more nuanced, almost like speech. Maya was recording everything on her phone, her anthropologist training overcoming her fear. "It's trying to communicate directly," she whispered. "The cadence suggests language, not just vocalization." As if in response, the being raised both hands, making complex gestures that seemed purposeful and precise. Then it reached into a kind of pouch or fold in its fur, and withdrew an object that gleamed even in the diffuse light. Another stone disc, larger than the one found at David and Maya's cabin, elaborately carved with spiraling patterns. With deliberate slowness, it placed the disc on the ground halfway between us, then retreated to its original position. "It's a gift," Maya said, her voice hushed with wonder. "Or a message." "Should we approach?" Jack asked, his scientific curiosity visibly warring with caution. Before anyone could answer, Lindsay gasped. She was looking at her recording equipment's display. "The electromagnetic pattern," she said. "It matches the carvings on the disc, the same frequency, visualized differently." Maya took a careful step toward the disc, watching the silver-streaked being for any sign of disapproval. When none came, she moved forward until she could kneel and examine the object without touching it. "The spiral pattern radiates from the center," she reported, "similar to the pictograph on the tree, but more abstract. There are smaller symbols embedded within the spiral, possibly a form of writing." The being made another series of sounds, pointing first to the disc, then to Maya, then sweeping its arm to encompass all of us. The meaning seemed clear enough. "The disc is for you all to understand." I found myself moving forward to join Maya, drawn by an impulse I couldn't fully explain. As I neared the disc, a strange sensation washed over me, a buzzing in my ears, a lightness in my head, as if the boundary between myself and the forest was somehow thinning. The silver-streaked being watched me approach, its eyes revealing nothing of its thoughts. Up close, its features were more distinct. A broad, sloped forehead, a powerful jaw, a nose that was flatter and wider than a human's, but still recognizably a nose. Its eyes were deeply set, amber in color, with a depth of awareness that sent a shiver through me. As I knelt beside Maya, something compelled me to extend my hand toward the disc. Maya shot me a warning glance, but I felt certain this was the right action, the expected action. The moment my fingers touched the cool stone, the world around me shifted. The forest, the clearing, my companions, all seemed to recede, replaced by a cascade of images flowing directly into my mind. Ancient forests, untouched by human hands, teeming with life forms now extinct. Gatherings of the forest beings around stone circles, communicating through sound and gesture. Humans appearing at the edges of their territory. First indigenous peoples who approached with reverence, then later arrivals who brought destruction. A gradual retreat deeper into the remaining wilderness as human expansion continued, and most recently, the focus of their growing concern, changes in the forest itself. Dying trees, disappearing wildlife, altered weather patterns, and a sickness spreading through the earth that they could feel but couldn't heal. The message was unmistakable. Their world, our world, was in danger, and they had chosen to reveal themselves now out of desperation. When the vision cleared, I found myself still kneeling, the disc cool beneath my palm. Maya was watching me with concern, while my other companions remained in a loose circle, tense and uncertain. The forest beings hadn't moved, but their attention was focused entirely on me. "Adakai," Maya asked softly, "are you all right?" I nodded, finding my voice with effort. "They're showing us why they've made contact. The forest is dying. They feel it in ways we don't understand." Jack stepped forward cautiously. "A warning about climate change? Environmental degradation?" "More than that," I said, struggling to articulate what I'd experienced. "They're guardians of something ancient and vital. And it's failing." The silver-streaked being made another sound, softer now, almost mournful. It pointed to the fallen tree, then to the sky, then swept its arm in a circle that encompassed the entire forest. Maya's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The balance is broken," she said. "They're saying the natural order is disrupted." As if in confirmation, the being nodded, a surprisingly human gesture that underscored the intelligence behind those amber eyes. Lindsay had moved closer, her equipment still recording. "Ask them what they want us to do," she suggested. "If they're intelligent enough to communicate this much." They must have a reason for contacting us specifically. I looked to the silver-streaked being, spreading my hands in a questioning gesture. "How can we help?" I asked, keeping my voice soft but clear. The being made a complex series of gestures, pointing to each of us in turn, then to the north, where the mountains rose beyond the forest boundary. Its meaning was clear, even without words. "Follow us." Jack exchanged glances with Lindsay, then looked to me. "This is unprecedented," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Direct interaction, an invitation to their territory." "It could be dangerous," David cautioned. "We don't know their intentions." "I think we do," Maya countered. "They're asking for help with something they can't address alone. Why else reveal themselves after centuries of hiding?" I stood slowly, the disc still in my hand, feeling the weight of a decision that went far beyond personal safety. As wilderness rangers, we're trained to protect natural and cultural resources, understand the dangers of remote areas, and respond to emergencies. All skills that now seemed directly relevant to this unprecedented situation. "I think we need to follow them," I said finally. "At least see what they want to show us." The others debated briefly, but in the end, curiosity and the unprecedented nature of the opportunity outweighed caution. We gathered essential gear: water, emergency supplies, cameras, and recording equipment, leaving the heavier items in the vehicles. As we prepared, the forest beings watched with what seemed like approval. When we were ready, the silver-streaked individual made a beckoning gesture and began moving toward the northern edge of the clearing, its movements fluid and powerful despite its massive size. We followed, staying together in a tight group. The other beings melted into the forest ahead and beside us, occasionally visible through the trees but never fully exposed. Only our guide remained clearly in view, setting a pace that was challenging but manageable for humans on foot. The forest grew denser as we moved north, the fog lingering among the upper branches. The path, if it could be called that, seemed to shift and wind in patterns that defied the topographical maps I knew by heart. Several times I was certain we'd cross the same stream or pass the same distinctive rock formation, yet somehow we continued to move, generally northward. "Are we walking in circles?" David asked quietly after nearly an hour of hiking. "Not exactly," Lindsay replied, consulting a compass that spun erratically in her palm. "I think we're moving through folds in the landscape." "What does that mean?" I asked. Jack was studying his GPS unit, which showed our position jumping erratically across the map. "It means we're covering more distance than should be physically possible. The coordinates are inconsistent with the actual terrain." Maya had been observing our guide, noting its behavior. "I think they navigate by a different understanding of space," she suggested. "Not linear distances, but connections between places." The implications of this were both fascinating and unsettling. If these beings could somehow transcend normal spatial relationships, it would explain much about their ability to remain hidden for centuries despite human expansion. After what felt like hours, but might have been less, our guide stopped at the base of a sheer rock face that rose at least 100 feet upward. At first glance, it appeared to be a dead end, but as we watched, the being approached what seemed to be solid stone and simply walked through it. We froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Did anyone else see that?" David asked, his voice higher than normal. Before anyone could respond, our guide's head reappeared, emerging from what looked like solid rock. It made a beckoning gesture, then vanished again. Lindsay's instruments were going haywire, emitting erratic beeps and flashing warnings. "The electromagnetic distortion is off the charts," she reported. "It's some kind of... I don't even have a term for it." "A portal?" Jack suggested, his academic skepticism crumbling in the face of the impossible. Maya approached the rock face cautiously, her hand outstretched. Where the being had disappeared, the stone appeared to ripple slightly, like the surface of water disturbed by a gentle breeze. "It's an illusion," she said wonderingly. "Or rather, what we perceive as solid rock isn't actually there." I joined her, my ranger's instinct to protect my team warring with overwhelming curiosity. When I reached out, my fingers passed through what appeared to be solid stone, encountering only a slight resistance, like pushing through heavy curtains. "I'll go first," I decided, my heart pounding. "If it's safe, I'll call back." Before the others could object, I stepped forward into the illusion. There was a moment of disorientation, a sensation of pressure from all sides. Then I emerged into a dimly lit space that took my breath away. We had entered a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. Phosphorescent fungi along the walls provided a soft blue-green illumination that revealed stalagmites and stalactites of impossible size and beauty. An underground river flowed through the center, its water crystal clear and faintly luminescent. But most astonishing were the structures that filled the cavern, dwellings constructed of stone, wood, and what appeared to be woven plant fibers arranged in concentric circles around a central open area, an entire hidden settlement, invisible to the outside world. Our guide waited patiently as my companions emerged one by one, each registering shock and wonder as they took in the scene. More of the forest beings appeared, moving about their settlement with purpose, some stopping to observe us with evident curiosity. "This is incredible," Jack breathed, his camera forgotten in his hand. "An entire civilization, hidden within the mountains." Lindsay was already recording, her scientific training reasserting itself through her amazement. "The architecture suggests an advanced understanding of structural engineering, despite the absence of modern tools or materials." Maya was studying the beings themselves, noting the variations in size, coloration, and what appeared to be age. "There are family groups," she observed, "multiple generations living together." Our guide led us toward the central area, where a group of the older-looking beings had gathered in what appeared to be a council circle. At its center burned a fire that emitted no smoke, casting a warm golden light that contrasted with the blue-green phosphorescence of the cavern walls. As we approached, I noticed that the ground beneath our feet had changed. No longer natural stone, but a mosaic of pebbles arranged in intricate patterns similar to those on the disc I still carried. The patterns seemed to shift slightly as we walked, responding to our presence in ways that defied explanation. The eldest of the gathered beings rose as we neared, ancient beyond reckoning, its fur almost entirely silver, its movements slow but deliberate. It extended both hands in what was clearly a gesture of welcome, then indicated that we should sit within the circle. We complied, setting aside our equipment and taking places on smooth stone seats arranged for beings larger than humans. Our guide joined the circle, sitting opposite us beside the ancient one. For several minutes, there was silence as the gathered beings observed us with intelligent curiosity. Then the eldest made a series of complex vocalizations, gesturing first to us, then to the cavern around them, and finally upward toward the unseen forest above. Maya, who had been recording and analyzing their sounds, spoke quietly. "I think they're welcoming us to their home and explaining that this gathering is unprecedented, that humans haven't been brought here before." The Ancient One pointed to the disc I still held, then to its own head, then to mine, the same sequence our guide had used earlier. Understanding, I placed the disc on the ground before me. The elder nodded and produced another object, a crystalline formation that caught and refracted the firelight in mesmerizing patterns. It placed this beside the disc, then gestured for me to touch both objects simultaneously. I hesitated, looking to my companions. Maya nodded encouragement, while Jack and Lindsay watched with scholarly intensity. David looked nervous but didn't object. Taking a deep breath, I placed one hand on the disc and the other on the crystal. The effect was immediate and overwhelming, more powerful than the earlier vision by an order of magnitude. This time I wasn't just seeing images, I was experiencing them, as if my consciousness had been projected outside my body and across time itself. I witnessed the forest beings' history unfold over millennia, their evolution alongside but separate from humans, their development of a profound connection to the natural world that went beyond simple survival. I saw their retreat into hidden places as human civilization expanded, their decision to observe but rarely interact, their patient guardianship of ancient knowledge and natural balances. Then the visions shifted to the present crisis, a sickness spreading through the earth itself, invisible to human instruments but clear to their heightened senses. I felt their growing alarm as forests died, waterways became poisoned, and the delicate web of life began to unravel. Most disturbingly, I saw dark entities emerging from places where the natural balance had been most severely disrupted, shadow-like beings that seemed to feed on decay and destruction, growing stronger as ecosystems collapsed. These shadow entities were the true threat, not merely a symptom of environmental destruction, but something more sinister that exploited and accelerated it. The forest beings had contained them for centuries, but their power was waning as the natural world weakened. The final vision was the most urgent. A location deep within the national forest where a cluster of these shadow entities had gathered, centered around a site of recent human activity, mining exploration that had breached a sealed cavern system and unwittingly released something long imprisoned. With a gasp, I returned to my body, trembling with the force of the experience. The elder watched me with ancient eyes that held both compassion and urgency. "They need our help," I said to my companions, my voice hoarse. "There's something out there, something dangerous that's been released by human activity. They can't stop it alone." Jack leaned forward, his scientific skepticism momentarily forgotten. "What kind of something?" I struggled to articulate what I'd seen. Shadow entities, beings that feed on ecological destruction and death. They've been contained for generations, but they're growing stronger as the environment degrades. Lindsay was rapidly making notes. "That corresponds with anomalous readings we've been detecting at sites of severe environmental degradation. Energy patterns that don't match any known natural phenomenon." "Where are these entities now?" David asked, practical despite his evident discomfort. "There's an abandoned mining site in the eastern sector," I recalled. "Exploration was halted last year after a dispute over permitting, but not before they dug several test shafts." Maya had been observing the elder, who was making a series of gestures that seemed increasingly urgent. "They're saying we don't have much time," she interpreted. "Whatever was released is growing stronger with each cycle of the moon." The elder pointed to each of us in turn, then to its own warriors, then made a united gesture that needed no translation. "We must work together." Our guide, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now rose and retrieved a collection of objects from a nearby dwelling. Containers of what appeared to be pigments, bundles of herbs tied with sinew, and stone implements of various shapes and sizes. "Preparations for a ritual?" Maya suggested, her anthropologist's training evident in her analysis. "Many indigenous cultures use ceremonial approaches to restore balance or drive away negative entities." The elder nodded, gesturing toward the various items and then to our modern equipment. Another clear message: your technology and our ancient knowledge combined. For the next hour, we were instructed through gestures and demonstrations in the preparation of specific substances, pigments to be applied to skin in protective patterns, herbs to be burned in specific sequences, sounds to be produced at particular moments. Lindsay recorded everything meticulously, while Jack and David helped prepare the materials according to the being's guidance. Maya worked on establishing a more sophisticated form of communication, using her linguistic expertise to identify patterns in their vocalizations and gestures. By the end of the preparation period, she had compiled a basic lexicon that allowed for simple exchanges. "They call themselves the Anunnaki," she told us during a brief break. "It means something like ancient protectors or guardians of the deep places. They've existed alongside humanity for thousands of years, retreating further into isolation as our civilizations expanded." "And these shadow entities?" Jack asked. Maya consulted her notes. "They call them the devouring ones, beings from beyond the natural world that feed on destruction and decay. The Anunnaki have kept them contained through rituals and their connection to the Earth's energy. But that connection is weakening as ecosystems collapse." The implications were staggering. What we had stumbled upon wasn't merely an undiscovered species, but an ancient society with knowledge and abilities that defied our understanding of reality, knowledge that might be crucial to addressing threats we hadn't even recognized. As the preparations neared completion, our guide, who Maya had learned was called Kurak, a name that translated roughly to far seer. approached me with a small stone cup containing a thick, dark liquid. Through Maya's interpretation, I understood that drinking it would strengthen my connection to the earth energies the Anunnaki wielded, allowing me to perceive the shadow entities more clearly. The others would receive similar preparations, but as the first human to make contact through the disc, my role would be central to the coming confrontation. I accepted the cup, meeting Kurak's amber eyes with a nod of respect and trust. The liquid was bitter but not unpleasant, tasting of earth and green growing things with an undertone of something metallic and strange. As it took effect, my perception shifted subtly. The cavern seemed more alive, pulsing with energies I hadn't previously noticed. The phosphorescent fungi glowed brighter, and I could sense currents of power flowing through the stone beneath my feet, connecting to larger networks that extended throughout the mountains. Most significantly, I could now see what linked the Anunnaki to each other and to their environment, filaments of light that connected them to the earth, to the plants and fungi, to the water and air, forming a living matrix of interdependence and balance. Looking at my human companions, I saw that they too were connected to this web, though their filaments were fainter, less integrated into the larger pattern. As they consumed their own portions of the ritual substance, their connections brightened, becoming more clearly visible. The elder whom Maya had learned was called Turok, ancient wisdom, now rose to address our assembled group. Through a combination of Maya's translation and my enhanced perception, I understood their plan. We would travel to the breached mining site where the shadow entities had gathered, forming a circle of combined human technology and Anunnaki earth knowledge to contain and then banish them back to their own realm. The humans would bring instruments capable of generating specific electromagnetic frequencies that, when combined with the Anunnaki rituals, would create a barrier the shadow entities couldn't cross. It would be dangerous. The entities would resist, using fear and deception as weapons, attempting to separate us from each other and from our purpose. But if we succeeded, the breach could be sealed, preventing further incursion and buying time to address the larger environmental degradation that had weakened the natural barriers. As Turok finished speaking, a solemn mood settled over the gathering. What we were undertaking was unprecedented. Humans and Anunnaki working together against a threat neither fully understood, but both recognized as grave. Kurak approached me once more, this time carrying a staff of polished wood topped with a crystalline formation similar to the one I'd touched earlier. He offered it with a formal gesture, and I accepted it, feeling a surge of energy as my fingers closed around the smooth wood. Through Maya's translation, I understood that the staff was both tool and weapon, a focus for the earth energies we would need to channel, and a means of defense against the shadow entities. Similar implements were provided to each of my companions, tailored to their specific roles in the coming ritual. As we prepared to depart, gathering our equipment and the ritual materials, I found myself filled with a strange mixture of dread and purpose. The world I thought I knew had expanded dramatically in the span of a single day, revealing layers of reality and beings I had never imagined existing alongside us. Yet somehow, it felt right that I was here, that my path as a ranger had led me to this moment of convergence between worlds. My grandmother's stories of beings who walked between realms, of ancient guardians and old magic, no longer seemed like distant folklore but immediate reality. The Anunnaki formed a procession, led by Kurak, and flanked by warriors bearing implements that might have been ceremonial or defensive, perhaps both. We humans took our places in the center of the group, protected on all sides. As we moved toward the cavern entrance, Maya fell into step beside me, her expression a mix of academic fascination and personal wonder. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, "we're part of something few humans have ever experienced. A collaboration between species separated by thousands of years of parallel evolution, but united by a common home." I nodded, feeling the weight of the staff in my hand and the responsibility it represented. "Let's make sure it's not the last such collaboration," I replied. "We have a lot to learn from each other, if we survive what's coming." Ahead, the seeming solid rock of the cavern wall rippled like water, preparing to release us back into the world above. A world now revealed to be more complex, more wondrous, and more imperiled than I had ever imagined. We emerged from the cavern into a world transformed, or perhaps it was my perception that had changed. The forest pulsed with life and energy I'd never noticed before, each tree connected to its neighbors through networks of light visible beneath the soil. Birds and insects moved through webs of relationship, their life signatures bright against the backdrop of green. But there was darkness too, subtle at first, like patches of shadow where none should be, growing deeper and more malevolent as we moved eastward toward the abandoned mining site. The Anunnaki warriors grew more alert with each mile, their movements more cautious, their communication reduced to silent hand signals. Jack walked beside me, his scientific equipment recalibrated according to the Anunnaki's guidance. "The electromagnetic disturbances are getting stronger," he murmured, showing me a display of chaotic patterns. "Whatever these shadow entities are, they're generating energy signatures unlike anything in our databases." Lindsay was documenting everything with quiet precision, her earlier excitement tempered by the gravity of our mission. David stayed close to Maya, who continued to refine her understanding of the Anunnaki's communication system, occasionally exchanging phrases with Kurak. We traveled for what felt like hours, though time seemed increasingly fluid. The forest grew sparser, less vibrant as we approached our destination. Trees stood skeletal and gray, their life energies diminished to faint glimmers. The ground itself appeared diseased, with patches of blackened soil where nothing grew. "Environmental degradation," David noted, collecting samples with gloved hands. "But localized and spreading outward from a central point, not the usual pattern for industrial contamination." Kurak made a guttural sound of agreement, pointing ahead to where the tree line broke around a clearing. Through Maya's translation, he explained this was the outer boundary of the shadow entity's influence, the visible manifestation of their consumption of life energy. We paused at the forest edge, observing the scene before us. The mining company had cleared several acres for their exploratory operation, leaving behind the usual detritus of abandoned industrial sites, rusted equipment, concrete foundations, the skeletal frame of what had been a storage building. A series of test shafts punctured the earth like open wounds, surrounded by piles of excavated rock and soil. But it was the central shaft that commanded attention, a gaping hole approximately 20 feet across, descending into darkness. Around it, the ground appeared scorched and twisted, as if subjected to intense heat or pressure. And hovering above, barely visible except through my enhanced perception, was a writhing mass of shadow that seemed to both absorb and emit darkness. "The breach," Turok said through Maya, his ancient voice heavy with concern. They broke through the sealed chamber below and released what had been imprisoned there for countless generations. Through my staff, I could feel the wrongness emanating from the site, a discordant note in the symphony of natural energies, growing louder and more jarring with each moment. The shadow entities weren't just present, they were actively feeding, drawing life from the surrounding environment and transforming it into something corrupt and alien. We retreated a short distance to prepare. The Anunnaki began laying out the ritual space, a circle of stones positioned according to precise measurements, infused with mixtures of the pigments and herbs we'd prepared in the cavern. Jack and Lindsay set up their equipment at cardinal points around the circle, calibrating instruments to generate the frequencies that would reinforce the Anunnaki's more mystical barriers. David, whose scientific skepticism had been thoroughly challenged by recent events, nonetheless applied his practical knowledge to the task at hand. If these entities feed on environmental degradation, he reasoned, then ecological restoration might weaken them. It was a logical approach that bridged our different paradigms. While the Anunnaki's rituals might seem mystical to us, at their core was a profound understanding of natural systems and energy flows, not so different from our scientific models, just expressed in different language. With Maya's help, we integrated David's insight into the plan, adding elements designed to begin healing the damaged ecosystem, even as we contained the shadow entities. Seeds of native plants were mixed with the ritual substances, and patterns of restoration were added to the protective symbols. As dusk approached, we completed our preparations. The Anunnaki warriors took positions around the outer perimeter, while Turok, Kurak, and a small group of their most experienced ritualists joined us humans in the inner circle. We each stood at assigned positions, holding our staffs and wearing the protective symbols painted on our skin. Remember, Maya translated Turok's final instructions, these entities will attack through fear and deception. They will show you things that aren't real, try to separate you from the group, make you doubt what you know to be true. Keep your mind focused on the earth beneath your feet, the air in your lungs, the connection to those beside you. With these warnings fresh in our minds, we began. Jack and Lindsay activated their equipment, generating a low hum that gradually increased in complexity, layering frequencies according to the patterns the Anunnaki had shown them. The air within our circle began to vibrate, creating a tangible barrier between us and the outside world. The Anunnaki ritualists began a rhythmic chanting, their deep voices harmonizing in ways that seemed to connect directly to the earth beneath us. I felt my staff growing warm in my hands, the crystal at its top beginning to emit a soft blue light that pulsed in time with the chanting. As our combined energies built, I directed my focus toward the mining shaft and the writhing shadows above it. With my enhanced perception, I could see tendrils of darkness extending outward, probing the boundaries of our circle, testing for weaknesses. The confrontation began subtly, a whisper of doubt in my mind, suggesting this was all delusion, mass hallucination brought on by isolation and suggestion. I recognized the external source of these thoughts and pushed them away, grounding myself in the solid weight of the staff and the energy flowing through it. The attacks grew stronger. The shadows around the shaft began to coalesce into forms, humanoid shapes that somehow mimicked each of us, distorted reflections that moved with sinister purpose. My doppelganger stepped forward, mouth moving in words only I could hear. "This isn't real," it seemed to say, wearing my face but with eyes like empty pits. "You're losing your mind out here, alone in the wilderness. There are no forest giants, no shadow entities. You need medical help." I heard gasps from my companions, suggesting they were experiencing similar visions. David's face had gone pale, his knuckles white around his staff. Lindsay's equipment was registering wild fluctuations as the entities increased their assault. "Hold steady," I called out, as much to remind myself as to support the others. "It's trying to break our concentration, make us doubt what we've seen." The shadow forms pressed closer, their attacks becoming more personalized, more insidious. I saw flashes of my past failures, moments of weakness and doubt magnified into defining characteristics. The voices grew louder, suggesting that I was unworthy of this responsibility, that I would fail as I had failed before. Through sheer will, I maintained my position, focusing on the staff in my hands and the energy flowing through it. Beside me, Maya was reciting what sounded like protective phrases in multiple languages, her voice steady despite the sweat beading on her forehead. The pressure intensified, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe. The shadow entities had realized our purpose and were bringing their full force against us. Our circle held, but I could feel it straining, the human and Anunnaki energies struggling to maintain cohesion against the onslaught. Then Kurak stepped forward, raising his staff high. With a voice that seemed to resonate from the earth itself, he began a new chant, a summoning rather than a barrier. Maya translated fragments. He was calling upon the deepest forces of the forest, the ancient spirits of the mountains and waters, to join our struggle. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the surviving trees around us, from the streams that still ran clear, from the stones and soil and air itself, threads of golden light began to coalesce, flowing toward our circle and strengthening it from outside. These were the true spirits of place, the consciousness of the ecosystem itself, responding to the Anunnaki's call and recognizing the threat to its existence. Not personified entities like the Anunnaki or humans, but forces more elemental and in some ways more powerful, the collective life will of the natural world. With this reinforcement, our combined energies stabilized, the circle holding firm against the shadow entity's assault. Now it was time for the second phase of our plan. Under Turok's guidance, we began to contract the circle step by careful step, moving inward toward the mining shaft where the breach had occurred. The shadow entities fought viciously against this compression, their attacks growing more desperate and disjointed. They tried one final, devastating strategy, dividing their forces to target each of us individually with our deepest fears and insecurities. I found myself suddenly alone in what seemed like an endless dark forest. The path vanished, my companions nowhere to be seen. Panic rose in my throat as I tried to find my way back, but the staff in my hand remained warm and solid, its light a beacon in the manufactured darkness. I recognized the deception for what it was, and focused my mind on the true reality. The circle, my companions, our shared purpose. The illusion wavered, and then shattered, returning me to the mining site where the others were similarly breaking free of their own visions. United once more, we pressed forward in perfect synchrony, humans and Anunnaki moving as one force. The shadow entities retreated before us, driven back toward the shaft from which they had emerged. Their formless bodies twisted and contorted, losing cohesion as our combined light forced them from the natural world to which they did not belong. When we reached the edge of the shaft, the final stage began. The Anunnaki ritualists positioned themselves at equidistant points around the opening, their staffs planted firmly in the ground. Jack and Lindsay adjusted their equipment to emit a concentrated beam of energy directly into the depths below. Maya and I stood opposite each other across the shaft, our roles crucial to what came next. As the lone figures who had directly communicated with both human and Anunnaki worlds, we would serve as bridges, conducting energy between the different forces at work and helping to seal the breach from both sides. I raised my staff, feeling power surge through it and through me. Across the dark opening, Maya did the same, her eyes meeting mine with determined focus. Between us, the shadow entities swirled in frantic patterns, their substance diminishing as they were forced back toward their own realm. Turok and Kurak began the sealing ritual, ancient words rising and falling in complex patterns. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and deep within the shaft, something shifted. Rock grinding against rock as the ruptured barrier between worlds began to reform. The shadow entities made one final desperate effort. A tendril of darkness shot upward, wrapping itself around Maya's ankle and trying to drag her into the shaft. She cried out, her balance precarious at the edge of the abyss. Without thought, I leaped forward, staff extended. Golden light blazed from the crystal tip, severing the dark tendril and dissolving it into nothing. In the same motion, I caught Maya's outstretched hand, pulling her back from the brink as the sealing energies reached their crescendo. A sound like thunder rolled through the earth, and the shaft began to close. Not with falling rock or collapsing soil, but with a more fundamental restructuring of reality. The breach between worlds sealed itself, the natural order reasserting its boundaries against the intrusion. The shadow entities, trapped on their side of the newly formed barrier, emitted one final, rage-filled howl that echoed in our minds rather than our ears. Then they were gone, the darkness they had brought receding like mist in morning sunlight. We stood in stunned silence, the mining site now just an ordinary industrial ruin. The malevolent presence vanished as if it had never been. Only the damaged ecosystem around us testified to the reality of what had occurred. And even that was beginning to heal, the seeds and restorative elements we had included in our ritual already taking root in small bursts of green among the blackened soil. Exhaustion hit us all at once. I swayed on my feet, the staff suddenly heavy in my hands, its light dimmed to a faint glow. Around me, my companions showed similar signs of depletion, the energy we had channeled exacting a physical toll despite the Anunnaki's protective measures. Kurak approached, his massive form moving with unexpected gentleness. Through gesture and the few words Maya could still translate in her fatigued state, he indicated that we should return to their hidden sanctuary to recover our strength. The dangerous work was done, but much remained to be discussed. As we made our slow way back through the forest, I noticed that my enhanced perception remained. The webs of connection between living things were still visible to me, though less vivid than before. Something had changed permanently in how I perceived the world, a gift, or perhaps a responsibility, that would shape whatever came next. The journey back seemed shorter, less convoluted than our outward path. Perhaps the Anunnaki no longer felt the need to conceal their routes now that we had proven ourselves allies. Or perhaps my own perception had adjusted to their way of moving through the landscape. By the time we reached the hidden entrance to their cavern home, night had fallen fully, the forest quiet around us with a peace that felt earned rather than tenuous. The barrier between worlds was sealed, the shadow entities contained once more. But the larger issues remained. The environmental degradation that had weakened natural defenses, the need for ongoing vigilance, and the unprecedented alliance between humans and Anunnaki that had made victory possible. As we passed through the stone illusion into the luminescent cavern beyond, I sensed that our story was not ending but truly beginning, that the confrontation with the shadow entities was merely the first chapter in a longer, more complex narrative of cooperation and shared stewardship. The Anunnaki welcomed us back with solemn ceremony, tending to our exhaustion with restorative foods and medicines. As strength returned to my limbs and clarity to my mind, I found myself contemplating the immense significance of what had occurred and what might follow. We had touched another world, another intelligence, another perspective on existence itself, and in doing so, we had perhaps found a way forward for both our kinds, a path of collaboration rather than conflict, of shared knowledge rather than mutual ignorance. Sleep claimed me before I could fully articulate these thoughts, drawing me into dreams filled with golden light and ancient voices speaking of futures yet to be written. Dawn in the Anunnaki cavern was a subtle affair. No direct sunlight penetrated the stone, but the bioluminescent fungi along the walls brightened gradually, mimicking the diurnal cycle above. I woke feeling surprisingly refreshed, the physical and mental exhaustion of the previous day's battle replaced by a clarity of purpose I hadn't experienced before. My companions were already stirring, each processing our extraordinary experiences in their own way. Jack was deep in conversation with several younger Anunnaki, comparing notes on the electromagnetic properties of their crystal technologies. Lindsay methodically reviewed her recordings and measurements, creating what would become the first scientific documentation of Anunnaki culture and abilities. David had ventured to the underground river running through the cavern, collecting water samples and studying the unique ecosystem that had evolved in isolation from the surface world. Maya sat cross-legged with Turok and other Anunnaki elders, her linguistic skills advancing rapidly as she helped create a more comprehensive translation system between our languages. Kurak approached as I rose from my sleeping mat, offering a bowl of what appeared to be fruit. Some varieties I recognized from the forest above, others entirely new to me. Through gestures and the few phrases I'd learned, he indicated that a council meeting would begin soon to discuss the path forward. As I ate, I reflected on how quickly the extraordinary had become almost normal. Just days ago, my reality had been defined by routine ranger duties and the quiet solitude of my cabin by the lake. Now I sat in a hidden civilization of beings whose existence defied conventional understanding, preparing to discuss an alliance that could reshape our understanding of wilderness conservation, and perhaps much more. The council gathering was held in the central circle where we'd been welcomed the previous day. Anunnaki of various ages and roles sat alongside us humans, the traditional hierarchies of both species temporarily set aside in recognition of our shared accomplishment and common goals. Turok opened the proceedings with a formal acknowledgement of what had occurred, the successful sealing of the breach, the containment of the shadow entities, and the unprecedented cooperation between our kinds. Through Maya's increasingly fluent translation, he expressed the gratitude of his people and their hope that this marked the beginning of a new relationship rather than an isolated incident. For countless generations, Maya translated, we have watched your kind from the shadows, retreating further as your numbers and technology expanded. We believe separation was necessary for our survival and yours, but the shadow entities have shown us that isolation is no longer sustainable. The damage to the natural world affects us all, weakening the barriers between realms and threatening the balance we were born to protect. Jack spoke next, his scientific mind having rapidly integrated the new realities he'd witnessed. What we've experienced challenges our understanding of the world. but also offers unprecedented opportunities. Your knowledge of natural systems, your ability to sense ecological relationships invisible to our instruments, these could revolutionize our approach to environmental protection. Lindsay added her perspective, focusing on the practical applications. The electromagnetic technologies you've developed without industrial infrastructure, your sustainable use of bioluminescence and crystal energy, these could help us transition away from the destructive practices that are damaging the Earth. Throughout the discussion, I noticed a pattern emerging. Areas where our different knowledge systems complemented, rather than contradicted each other, creating a more complete understanding than either could achieve alone. The Anunnaki's deep connection to natural energies combined with our scientific instruments and models, their ancient oral tradition merged with our documentation and global communication networks. When my turn came to speak, I found myself addressing not just the immediate situation but a broader vision. As a ranger, I thought my role was to protect the wilderness from human impact, I said, Maya translating my words. Now I understand that true protection means facilitating balance between all beings who share these lands, human, Anunnaki, and the countless other species that depend on healthy ecosystems. Kurak responded with approval, adding that the Anunnaki had always seen themselves as guardians rather than owners of the land, a perspective that aligned well with the conservation ethics I had tried to uphold in my work. As the council continued, practical matters came to the fore. How would we maintain communication? Who would know of the Anunnaki's existence? What areas of cooperation should take priority? A plan gradually took shape. I would serve as the primary human liaison, my position as ranger providing both access to the wilderness and legitimate reason to spend time in remote areas. Jack and Lindsay would document the scientific aspects of our findings, creating secure records while respecting the Anunnaki's need for privacy. Maya would continue developing our translation capabilities, while David would focus on ecological restoration projects that could strengthen natural defenses against any future incursions. Most importantly, we would establish regular meetings between selected humans and Anunnaki representatives to share knowledge, monitor for signs of shadow entity activity, and coordinate efforts to heal damaged ecosystems throughout the protected wilderness. Turok emphasized that while our group had earned the trust of the Anunnaki, broader revelation of their existence remained too risky. Human history was filled with examples of exploitation and destruction of the unknown, something both they and we acknowledged with sober recognition. The time may come for wider understanding, Maya translated his words, but that day is not yet here. For now, we work in the shadows, as we have always done, but no longer alone. The council concluded with a ceremony that formalized our alliance. Each human received a crystal similar to those in our staffs, smaller versions that could be worn discreetly as pendants, allowing for a subtle connection to the Anunnaki energy network and serving as a means of communication in emergencies. In return, we offered technology that would help the Anunnaki monitor broader environmental conditions, weather-resistant tablets loaded with scientific data, solar chargers, and communication devices modified to work with their unique energy signatures. As the ceremony ended, a sense of profound possibility hung in the air. We had faced an immediate threat and prevailed, but the real work, the long, patient labor of healing damaged ecosystems and building understanding between our worlds, was just beginning. The journey back to the surface world felt like crossing a threshold in more ways than one. Though we would physically leave the Anunnaki sanctuary, we carried with us knowledge that would forever change how we perceived the wilderness and our place within it. Kurak and a small group of Anunnaki accompanied us to the forest edge, where the transition would be less visually jarring to any humans who might be in the area. Though their figures would appear as sudden shadows among the trees to conventional perception, my enhanced senses allowed me to see them clearly. Tall, powerful forms moving with natural grace through their ancestral home. Our parting was not a goodbye, but a pause. In 3 days' time, I would return to a designated meeting point, bringing initial reports from our respective fields. Jack and Lindsay would analyze the data we'd collected. David would begin drafting restoration plans, and Maya would continue refining our translation capabilities. As Kurak made the formal gesture of farewell, touching his forehead and then extending his hand toward me, I felt a surge of connection through the crystal pendant now hanging at my chest. Not words exactly, but a clear sentiment. Until we meet again, Guardian of Two Worlds. The humans among us returned to their various destinations. Jack and Lindsay to their research facilities. David and Maya to their cabin on the South Shore. I headed back to my ranger station, my mind already composing the carefully edited reports I would need to file. Director Reyes would receive a partial truth, enough to explain our absence and justify the ecological restoration projects we would propose, but omitting the Anunnaki entirely. Instead, I would attribute our findings to previously unidentified environmental factors, backed by the scientific data Jack and Lindsay had collected. Not a complete lie, but a necessary omission for now. My cabin seemed simultaneously familiar and strange when I finally returned, the simple furniture and equipment unchanged, but my perception of the world around it utterly transformed. Through my window, I could now see the subtle energies flowing through the forest, the connections between living systems that had always been there but invisible to my unenhanced senses. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars reflect in Obsidian Lake, I thought about my grandmother's stories, tales of beings who walked between worlds, of humans who learned to see beyond ordinary reality, of ancient pacts and shared guardianship. She had been preparing me all along, I realized, passing down knowledge that her ancestors had preserved through generations. Perhaps the relationship between humans and Anunnaki hadn't always been characterized by separation. Perhaps there had been earlier alliances, earlier collaborations. Their memory preserved in indigenous folklore while being dismissed as myth by the wider world. In the distance, a call echoed through the forest, not the eerie, otherworldly sound that had first caught my attention weeks ago, but something both familiar and new. An Anunnaki voice reaching out across the divide, acknowledging our shared watch over the wilderness. I raised my hand in greeting, though I knew they were too far away to see it. The crystal pendant warmed against my skin, transmitting my response more effectively than any gesture. I am here. I am watching. I stand with you. The full moon rose over the eastern ridges, bathing the forest in silver light that revealed hidden depths and textures to my enhanced vision. Somewhere out there, the Anunnaki were making their nightly rounds, ensuring the sealed breach remained secure, monitoring the health of their territory. And here I sat, a human ranger with a new understanding of what stewardship truly meant, not just protecting wilderness from human impact, but actively fostering the complex relationships that sustained all life, visible and invisible, acknowledged and hidden. Two worlds, I thought, but one forest. Two species, but one purpose. As I finally turned in for the night, I left my window open, allowing the sounds and scents of the wilderness to fill my cabin. The separation between inside and outside, between human space and wild space, seemed increasingly arbitrary, a line drawn for convenience rather than reflecting any true division in the living world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, reports to file, patrols to conduct, the careful balance of official duties and newfound responsibilities. But for now, I slept deeply, dreaming of ancient trees with roots that connected continents, of crystals that sang with the voice of the earth itself, and of shadows receding before the light of understanding. When morning came, I woke to find a small object on my windowsill, a perfectly formed pine cone unlike any I'd seen before, its scales arranged in the same spiral pattern as the Anunnaki stone disk. A reminder and a promise from my new allies, a symbol of the cycles of growth and renewal that would guide our work together. I placed it carefully on my desk beside my ranger badge, these two emblems of guardianship now equally meaningful to me. Then I stepped outside into the dawn light, ready to begin my first day as a bridge between worlds, a translator of ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, a guardian of the wilderness in all its seen and unseen dimensions. The forest waited, alive with possibility, its secrets no longer entirely hidden from my eyes. And somewhere within its depths, the Anunnaki watched with cautious hope, their isolation ended, their future now intertwined with ours for better or worse. Together, we would face whatever came next: shadow entities or environmental threats, human encroachment or natural disasters. Not as separate species defending separate territories, but as fellow guardians of a shared home, united in purpose, if different in form. The path ahead would not be easy. Old fears and prejudices ran deep on both sides, and the larger human world remained unprepared for the knowledge we now carried. But the first step had been taken, the first bridge built, and in that beginning lay hope, not just for the Anunnaki and humans in our small corner of the wilderness, but perhaps eventually for a wider healing between our kinds and the natural world that sustained us all. As I shouldered my pack and set out on the day's patrol, the crystal pendant warm against my chest, I thought of my grandmother's favorite saying, "The longest journey begins with a single step taken in good faith." We had taken that step. The journey was now underway, and the wilderness around us, alive with ancient awareness and new possibility, would never be the same again. The old house at the end of Maple Street had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. From the outside, it appeared ordinary: peeling paint, overgrown yard, broken windows. Yet something about it had always unsettled me. Growing up in this small town, I'd heard countless rumors about the place, each more disturbing than the last. "They say nobody's made it past midnight in there," my friend Jack whispered as we stood across the street, staring at the dilapidated structure. The autumn wind carried dead leaves across the cracked sidewalk, swirling them around our feet. People go in, but something changes them. Jack had always been the daredevil of our group, constantly pushing boundaries. His rugged features were now partially hidden behind a scruffy beard, but his eyes still held that mischievous glint from our childhood. At 32, we should have outgrown such fascinations, yet here we were. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "One night, just us, we document everything." He held up his camera bag. "For the channel." Our small paranormal investigation channel had garnered modest attention online, but nothing substantial. Jack believed this house could change everything. I wasn't convinced. "I've researched the history," he continued. "The Winters family disappeared in 1984. Mother, father, son. No bodies, no evidence of foul play. They simply vanished." A chill crept up my neck as I studied the house. The windows seemed to watch us, like vacant eyes observing our every move. The rational part of my brain dismissed such thoughts as imagination. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was aware of our presence. "The neighbors reported hearing strange sounds for weeks before the disappearance," Jack said. "Scratching from inside the walls, voices with no source. And every electronic device in a 3-house radius malfunctioned regularly." "Urban legends," I replied, attempting to sound dismissive despite my growing unease. "Maybe, but don't you want to know for sure?" By nightfall, we had gathered our equipment: cameras, audio recorders, flashlights, and a thermal imaging device Jack had spent too much money on. Our third team member, Becky, had declined to join us, citing a bad feeling about the place. In retrospect, I should have heeded her intuition. The house loomed larger in the darkness, a black silhouette against the night sky. No stars shone above it, as though the very heavens avoided this place. The porch steps creaked under our weight, each sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "After you," Jack gestured toward the door with an exaggerated bow. I pushed against the weathered wood, surprised when it swung open easily. The hinges should have been rusted shut after so many years of neglect. Instead, they moved smoothly, without a sound, as if recently oiled. The air inside hit me like a physical presence, stale, yet charged with something I couldn't identify. Our flashlights carved tunnels through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and floors thick with dust. Except, I noticed with growing concern, there were clear pathways through that dust, as if someone or something had been moving through the house regularly. "Check this out," Jack whispered, pointing to the floor. Footprints. Small footprints, child-sized, formed a path from the entrance toward the staircase. They appeared fresh, the dust displaced recently. Probably neighborhood kids, I suggested, not believing my own words. Daring each other to enter the scary house. Jack nodded, but his expression betrayed his doubt. Let's set up base in the living room. We placed cameras at strategic points throughout the ground floor, aiming to capture any movement or anomalies. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the settings on my camera. The stillness of the house felt artificial, like a held breath. Jack's voice broke the silence. The temperature's dropping. It's 10 degrees colder near the staircase. I joined him, watching the thermal imager's display fluctuate. The cold spot moved, drifting slowly up the stairs like an invisible presence ascending to the second floor. Equipment malfunction, I said automatically, though we both knew the device had been thoroughly tested. A soft thump from above made us freeze. Then another, rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps crossing the upstairs hallway. Jack's eyes widened with excitement rather than fear. "This is it," he whispered, already moving toward the stairs. "This is what we've been waiting for." I followed reluctantly, each step upward increasing the pressure in my chest. The wood beneath our feet felt wrong, too solid for a house this old, too resonant. Each footfall produced an echo, slightly out of sync with our movements, as if the sound were being mimicked by something else. The upstairs hallway stretched before us, doors lining both sides. All closed except one at the far end, which stood slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within. Not electrical, but the unsteady glow of what appeared to be candlelight. "Someone's here," I whispered, gripping Jack's arm. He shook his head. "No one's been in this house for years, not living anyway." "Then what's that light?" Before he could answer, the door at the end of the hall swung open completely. The candlelight vanished, plunging the room beyond into darkness. But in that brief illumination, I glimpsed something that stopped my heart momentarily. A small figure standing perfectly still, facing our direction. "Did you see that?" My voice was barely audible. Jack nodded slowly, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by caution. Child-sized, just like the footprints. We approached the room cautiously, our flashlights creating distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The room had once been a child's bedroom, faded dinosaur wallpaper peeled from the walls, and a small bed frame stood in the corner, its mattress long gone. In the center of the room sat a toy, a wind-up music box that appeared impossibly clean amidst the surrounding decay. Its porcelain surface gleamed in our flashlight beams. "That wasn't here before," Jack said with certainty. "Someone placed it there moments ago." I circled the room, flashlight beam searching every corner. There's nowhere to hide in here, no closet, no connecting door. And yet, Jack knelt beside the music box. "This thing looks brand new." "Don't touch it," I warned, too late. His fingers had already made contact with the wind mechanism. The box began to play a distorted melody, notes warped and wrong, as if the mechanism had been deliberately damaged to create disharmony. The sound crawled across my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. As the discordant music played, the temperature plummeted. Our breath clouded before us, and frost began forming on the window glass. Impossible for an autumn night that had been mild just hours before. The music stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, a child's laugh echoed from somewhere in the house. Not from the hallway or any adjacent room, but from everywhere at once, as if the house itself were producing the sound. Jack stood, his face pale. "We need to check the recordings." We retreated downstairs, neither of us acknowledging our quickened pace. The living room, where we'd set up our base, felt different now, the dimensions subtly wrong, corners too sharp, ceiling slightly lower than before. Jack reviewed the footage on his laptop while I checked the audio recordings. What we found defied explanation. The video showed us setting up equipment, moving around the house. But it also captured shadows that moved independently of us, following our movements at a distance. More disturbing were the audio recordings. Beneath our recorded conversations was another layer of sound. Whispers, too faint to discern words, but clearly human voices engaged in continuous, urgent communication. "We need more," Jack insisted, his initial fear now replaced by fascination. This could be the most significant paranormal evidence ever captured. I wasn't sharing his enthusiasm. Something felt fundamentally wrong about this house, beyond typical haunting phenomena. The air had grown thick, difficult to breathe, carrying a faint metallic taste. "I think we should leave," I said quietly. "Come back in daylight with more people." Jack shook his head. "It's not even midnight. The phenomena are just beginning." He checked his watch and frowned. "That's strange." "What?" My watch stopped at 11:17. He held it up. "Battery's new." I checked my phone. The screen showed the same time, 11:17, despite the fact that we'd been in the house for well over 2 hours. According to our devices, time had stopped moving forward. A loud crack from the kitchen startled us both. It sounded like wood splitting under immense pressure. We approached cautiously, flashlights revealing a shocking sight. The kitchen table, a heavy oak piece that must have weighed hundreds of pounds, had been broken in half, as if something had smashed it from above. This wasn't the subtle phenomena we'd hoped to document. This was physical, undeniable, and terrifying. "We need to leave. Now." My voice sounded strange even to myself, thin and stretched. For once, Jack didn't argue. We moved toward the front door, only to find it shut, though we'd left it open to bring in equipment. Jack reached for the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. "It's stuck," he muttered, pulling harder. "Let me try." I gripped the handle, applying all my strength. The door remained immovable, as if it had been sealed into its frame. The laugh came again. That child's laugh, but altered now, deeper, and somehow older. It emanated from the walls themselves, vibrating through the floorboards beneath our feet. "The windows," Jack suggested, already moving toward the living room's large bay window. I followed, only to stop short at what I saw. Outside, where there should have been a view of the street, neighboring houses, the normal world, there was nothing. Absolute darkness pressed against the glass, not the darkness of night, but a complete absence of light or feature, as if the house now existed in a void. "What's happening?" Jack's voice cracked. He reached toward the glass but stopped before making contact. The darkness beyond the window shifted, swirled, like something massive moving just out of sight. And then, pressed against the glass from the outside, a small hand appeared, palm flat, fingers splayed. A child's hand, but wrong. The proportions slightly off, the fingers too long. Jack stumbled backward. This can't be." More hands appeared at every window, pressing against the glass, dozens of them, belonging to beings we couldn't see. The pressure increased until the windows began to crack, thin fractures spreading across the surface like spider webs. "Upstairs," I gasped, grabbing Jack's arm. "We need to find another way out." As we turned toward the staircase, the lights on our cameras flickered and died simultaneously. Our flashlights followed seconds later, plunging us into absolute darkness. The only sound was our ragged breathing, and somewhere in the distance, that distorted music box melody beginning to play again. In the darkness, the house seemed to breathe around us. Without our flashlights, we navigated by touch, feeling our way toward the stairs. My fingers brushed against the wallpaper, which felt damp and pulsed slightly beneath my touch. I yanked my hand away, wiping it against my jeans. "Keep moving," I whispered to Jack, who was close behind me. "Don't stop." We ascended the stairs, each step feeling slightly higher than it should have been, as if the house were subtly altering its dimensions. At the top, I paused, trying to orient myself in the pitch darkness. The hallway should have been directly ahead, but instead, my outstretched hands met empty space. "This isn't right," I said. "The layout's changed." "Impossible," Jack replied, but his voice lacked conviction. A soft green glow emanated from further within this new space. Not electrical light, but something phosphorescent and unnatural. It provided just enough illumination to reveal that we were no longer in the upstairs hallway we had explored earlier. Instead, we stood at the entrance to a vast room that should not have existed within the confines of the house. The ceiling arched high above us, disappearing into darkness, while the walls extended far beyond the physical dimensions the house should have contained. Most disturbing were the markings covering every surface, symbols and script in no language I recognized, drawn in what looked unsettlingly like dried blood. "We've studied this house," Jack whispered. "The floor plans, the history, This room doesn't exist. It does now. I took a hesitant step forward, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The green light originated from a circular depression in the center of the room, a pool of luminescent liquid that moved with apparent consciousness, forming patterns and shapes before dissolving and reforming. As we approached, the liquid responded to our presence, swirling more rapidly and brightening. Jack, despite his earlier fear, had reverted to his documentarian instincts. He pulled out his phone, attempting to record what we were seeing. "Still stuck at 11:17, he muttered, "but it's working as a camera." The screen showed only static. "Whatever this place is," I said, "it's interfering with electronics." "Or time itself," Jack suggested. "Maybe we're—" A sound interrupted him, scratching from inside the walls, growing louder, moving closer. It surrounded us, coming from all directions at once. Not the claws of some animal, but something harder, like bone against wood. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by whispers, countless voices speaking in unison, too low to distinguish words but conveying unmistakable urgency. They seemed to be repeating something, a phrase or name, over and over. "They're saying something," Jack said, tilting his head as if to hear better. "It sounds like—" "Don't listen," I interrupted, grabbing his arm. "We need to keep moving." But Jack seemed transfixed, his eyes unfocused. "They're calling to us," he whispered. "They want us to see." Before I could respond, the floor beneath our feet shifted. The symbols etched into the stone began to glow with the same phosphorescence as the pool, forming a path that led to a previously unseen doorway in the far wall. "We should follow it," Jack said, his voice strangely monotone. "That's exactly what we shouldn't do," I countered. But he was already moving, drawn forward as if in a trance. I followed reluctantly, afraid to let him go alone. The doorway led to a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. The steps were worn in their centers, suggesting centuries of use in a house that was barely 100 years old. We descended for what felt like far too long, the staircase taking us deep underground, well below where the house's foundation should have been. The air grew increasingly cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and decay. Finally, the stairs ended at a small antechamber carved directly from bedrock. 3 tunnels branched off from this central point, each identical and equally uninviting. From the leftmost tunnel came the sound of the music box, its warped melody now interspersed with what sounded like a child counting. 1, 2, 3. The voice was young but hollow, as if spoken through water. 4, 5, 6. "We should go back," I said, tugging at Jack's sleeve. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the tunnel entrances. "I recognize this from the research. The Winter's Sun. He was obsessed with a counting game before they disappeared. It was in the police reports from neighbors. 7, 8, 9. The counting continued, echoing from the tunnel. "It wants us to follow," Jack said, taking a step toward the sound. I grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Think about what you're saying. It wants us to follow, not him. It. Whatever's in there isn't a child." Jack blinked, seeming to emerge from his trance-like state. Fear returned to his expression. "You're right. This is wrong. All of it." He turned back toward the staircase. "Let's try to find another way out." But the staircase was gone. In its place was solid rock wall, as if it had never existed at all. 10, the child's voice finished, suddenly much closer. "Ready or not?" The green glow from above dimmed, leaving us in near total darkness. Only a faint luminescence from the tunnel mouth provided any light. The counting voice had gone silent, but something else replaced it, the sound of small feet on stone, moving in our direction. Without discussion, we pressed ourselves against the wall farthest from the approaching sound. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain it would give us away. A figure emerged from the leftmost tunnel, small, child-sized, but moving with a jerking, unnatural gait. In the minimal light, I could make out only its silhouette, a boy of perhaps 8 or 9, wearing what appeared to be pajamas. He stood perfectly still at the tunnel entrance, head tilted as if listening. Then, slowly, he turned to face directly where we hid in the shadows. I couldn't see his face clearly, but something about the shape was wrong. The proportions distorted, the features seemingly rearranged. He raised one arm, pointing at us with unnatural precision despite the darkness. "Found you," he said, his voice overlapping with others, as if multiple entities spoke through him simultaneously. Jack made a strangled sound beside me. The boy cocked his head at an impossible angle, neck bent nearly 90 degrees. "Do you want to know what happened to the Winters?" the boy asked, taking a step toward us. "Do you want to know what happens to everyone who stays past midnight?" "We're leaving," I managed to say, my voice barely functioning. "We don't want to know." The boy laughed, that same laugh we'd heard throughout the house, but now revealing its true nature. Not a child's innocent mirth, but something ancient and hungry, merely wearing the sound like an ill-fitting costume. "Too late," the boy said, his head still at that impossible angle. "No one leaves. They only join." He took another step forward, and in that movement his form seemed to flicker, for an instant revealing something else beneath the child's appearance, something composed of angles that shouldn't exist, of limbs too numerous and joints too flexible. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Jack toward the rightmost tunnel. We fled into the darkness, the sound of skittering movement close behind. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching repeatedly. We chose directions at random, driven by blind panic rather than any navigational logic. "It's hurting us," Jack gasped as we paused at yet another junction. Every turn we're being guided somewhere specific. He was right. Despite the maze-like quality of the tunnels, there was a pattern to them, a subtle downward slope, a gradual narrowing. We were being channeled deeper, toward something at the center of this impossible labyrinth. The tunnel we'd chosen opened suddenly into a vast cavern, so large our meager light couldn't illuminate its boundaries. The air felt different here, charged with static electricity that made the hair on my arm stand on end. The floor beneath our feet was no longer stone, but something that yielded slightly with each step, like flesh. In the center of the cavern stood a structure, not built but grown, an organic architecture of bone and sinew forming an archway. Within the arch was not stone or wall, but a shimmering vertical surface like disturbed water. Jack approached it, mesmerized despite everything we'd experienced. "It's a doorway," he whispered, "but not to anywhere in our world." He was right. Through the liquid-like surface I could glimpse another place, a landscape of twisted geometry and impossible colors, where shapes moved that bore no resemblance to anything earthly. The Winters didn't disappear, I realized aloud. They were taken. Through this. The skittering sound returned, now from multiple directions. Not just the boy, but many entities approaching through different tunnels. The house wasn't haunted. It was a trap, a lure designed to bring people to this place. "We need to destroy it," Jack said suddenly, backing away from the arch. "Seal it somehow." Before we could consider how, the cavern began to tremble. Dust and small stones rained from above as a low rumbling filled the space. The doorway's surface rippled violently, and something began to emerge. First just a protrusion, then a limb of sorts, though it constantly shifted form, as if our reality couldn't properly contain its true shape. More children appeared at the tunnel entrances. Not just the boy we'd seen, but dozens of them, of varying ages and from different time periods based on their clothing. All had the same wrong proportions, the same tilted heads, the same empty eyes that reflected green in our light. Among them, I recognized clothing that matched descriptions of the Winters family from old photographs. "They're not real," Jack whispered. "They're just puppets, impressions left behind." The children began to advance in unison, moving with that same jerking gait. Behind them came adult figures, more victims from across decades or even centuries. "The door," I said suddenly. "It can only exist because of the house above. The house anchors it in our reality." Jack's eyes widened with understanding. "We need to destroy the house." "How?" "We're trapped down here, and it's past midnight now, real time, no matter what our watches say." A tremor ran through the fleshy floor beneath us as the entity continued its emergence from the doorway, more of it visible now, a mass of shifting limbs and organs that followed no biological logic. One of the child figures spoke, its voice that same overlapping chorus. "The door opens fully at midnight. When it does, what waits on the other side will be free. It's been so long." I glanced at Jack, a desperate plan forming. The house. You brought flares for the video shoot, right? He nodded, reaching into his bag. 4 emergency flares. But how does that help us? This place, this cavern, it's directly connected to the house. They're the same entity in a way. I pointed to the organic walls, which pulsed with the same rhythm as the wallpaper had upstairs. If we set fire to this, it might spread upward. Jack pulled out the flares. Worth trying, but we'll be trapped in the fire too. Better than the alternative, I said, nodding toward the emerging entity, which had now extruded enough of itself to form a towering mass nearly reaching the cavern ceiling. We struck the flares simultaneously, their harsh red light momentarily blinding after so long in near darkness. The child figures recoiled, shrinking back from the light. The walls of the cavern rippled and contracted as if in pain. "The support structures," Jack shouted, pointing to organic columns that resembled massive arteries connecting floor to ceiling. We pressed the flares against these structures, which ignited immediately, burning with unnatural intensity. The fire spread rapidly, racing along the walls and ceiling. The cavern filled with a terrible keening sound, like thousands of voices crying out at once. The child figures began to disintegrate, their forms unraveling into threads of shadow that were consumed by the spreading flames. The doorway's surface boiled and steamed, the emerging entity thrashing in apparent agony as the fire reached it. "Find the way up," I shouted over the cacophony. "There has to be a connection to the house." We searched frantically as the fire spread, eventually discovering a narrow vertical shaft in the cavern wall, like an esophagus leading upward. With no other option, we began to climb, using protrusions in the organic wall as handholds. The shaft contracted around us, attempting to crush or expel us, but the fire had weakened its structure. We climbed desperately, the heat intensifying below us, the air growing thick with smoke and the stench of burning organic matter. After what seemed an eternity, the shaft opened into the house's basement, a space we hadn't explored earlier. The fire had indeed spread upward, and the basement was already engulfed in flames that behaved like no normal fire, consuming the structure with unnatural speed. "Up! Keep moving!" I pulled Jack toward the stairs leading to the ground floor. We navigated through rooms now transformed by flame, the house's true nature revealed as its mundane appearance burned away. Beneath the wallpaper and floorboards was not wood and plaster, but organic tissue, now blackening and curling in the heat. The front door, previously sealed shut, hung open now, the house's defenses weakened by the destruction of its true form. Outside, the void had disappeared, replaced by the normal view of the quiet neighborhood street. We stumbled out onto the lawn, collapsing at a safe distance as the house was consumed. The flames rose impossibly high, taking on shapes that resembled writhing figures. A sound emanated from the blaze, not the normal crackle of burning wood, but screams of inhuman rage and pain. Neighbors emerged from surrounding houses, drawn by the spectacle. Emergency vehicles arrived shortly after, though there was clearly nothing that could be done to save the structure. We watched in exhausted silence as the house burned to its foundation, taking with it whatever doorway or entity had existed beneath. The official report listed the cause of the fire as undetermined, though arson was suspected. Jack and I gave statements that carefully omitted the impossible truths, describing a tragic accident with our equipment. The authorities seemed eager to accept this explanation for what was, to them, simply the destruction of an abandoned property. The physical injuries were minimal, some burns, smoke inhalation, cuts, and bruises from our escape, but the psychological impact proved far greater and more persistent. 3 days after the fire, I began to notice subtle changes in my apartment. Objects moved between rooms when I wasn't looking. Electronics malfunctioned with increasing frequency. Most disturbing were the sounds at night, soft footsteps in empty hallways, and occasionally distant counting. I called Jack, who had been avoiding my texts and calls since the night of the fire. "Are you experiencing anything unusual?" I asked when he finally answered. A long pause, then, quietly, "It followed us." "What do you mean?" "Not all of it burned," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "It attached itself to us somehow, like spores, seeds." I closed my eyes, remembering the organic walls of the cavern, how they had seemed to pulse against my fingertips. What do we do now? I don't know. I've been researching nonstop. There are similar accounts throughout history. Different locations, different manifestations, but the same basic pattern. People encounter something they can't explain, and afterward, it haunts them. Not as ghosts, but as infections. That word, infection, resonated with terrible clarity. What we had encountered wasn't a haunting in any traditional sense. It was more like a parasite from another reality, using our world, our perceptions, even our bodies as hosts. Have you noticed any physical changes? Jack asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. I hadn't wanted to acknowledge the small alterations I'd observed, the increased sensitivity to light, the strange patterning that had appeared on my skin in places hidden by clothing, like bruises that formed symbols similar to those we'd seen in the house. Yes, I admitted, nothing obvious, but yes, we need to meet, compare notes, figure out if there's a way to stop this. We arranged to meet at a public place, a cafe downtown, crowded enough to provide some sense of security. When Jack arrived, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight, his skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes were bloodshot from apparent sleeplessness. You look terrible, I said as he sat down. It's worse at night, he replied simply. That's when it's most active. What exactly is it? He glanced around nervously before answering. I think what we encountered was just a small outpost, a beachhead of sorts. The house was a structure built specifically to maintain a connection between our reality and somewhere else. The doorway we saw was just one of many. And now that connection is inside us, I concluded. He nodded grimly. It's trying to rebuild what we destroyed, using us as the new foundation. The implications were horrifying. We had escaped the house, only to become houses ourselves, vessels for whatever entity had been trying to emerge. There might be a way to stop it, Jack said, lowering his voice further. The symbols we saw, I've been researching them. They appear in obscure texts throughout history, always associated with boundaries between worlds. And according to some sources, the connection can be severed, but the process is extreme. The process, as Jack described it, involved ritual elements that sounded more like torture than treatment. Exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies, immersion in water containing certain mineral compounds, and ultimately, a form of controlled electrical shock meant to disrupt the parasite's hold. This is insane, I said after he finished. More insane than what we've already experienced? He pushed up his sleeve, revealing his forearm. The skin there had changed texture, becoming rougher, almost bark-like in places. It's spreading faster than I expected. We don't have much time. We spent the next week gathering the necessary components for Jack's desperate remedy. By then, the changes had accelerated in both of us. My sleep was perpetually disturbed by vivid nightmares featuring that underground cavern and its doorway. Worse, I sometimes woke to find myself in different rooms of my apartment with no memory of having moved there, as if something else had been controlling my body while my conscious mind was subdued. Jack's condition deteriorated more rapidly than mine. When we met to finalize our preparations, half his face had developed that same bark-like texture, and one eye had changed color entirely, the iris now that same phosphorescent green we'd seen in the cavern. It's gaining control, he said, his speech slightly slurred as if the changes were affecting his mouth. We need to do this now. We chose an isolated location for the procedure, an abandoned industrial building on the outskirts of town. The large metal structure would help amplify the electromagnetic field we needed to generate, according to Jack's research. As we set up the equipment, I noticed Jack moving differently, his gait becoming more like the jerking motion we'd seen in those child figures. Several times he paused mid-action, head tilting at an unnatural angle, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Jack? I approached him during one such episode. Are you still with me? His head snapped back to a normal position, eyes focusing on me with effort. Less and less, he admitted. It's like being pushed into a corner of my own mind. I can still observe, but influencing actions is getting harder. Maybe we should get real help, medical help. He laughed bitterly. And tell them what? That we're being colonized by interdimensional parasites? They'll institutionalize us, and while we're sedated and restrained, the transformation will complete. He was right, of course. There was no conventional help for our situation. We had ventured beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality and encountered something science could not yet comprehend, let alone treat. The procedure itself was brutal in its simplicity. We filled a metal tub with water containing the mineral compounds Jack had specified. A modified electrical system was connected to the tub, not enough current to kill, but sufficient to create a significant shock. "I'll go first," Jack insisted. "If something goes wrong, you'll still have a chance to run, to find another solution." I wanted to argue but couldn't. His transformation had progressed much further than mine. Whatever window of opportunity existed for him was rapidly closing. He removed his shirt, revealing skin that was now more foreign than human. Patches of bark-like texture interspersed with areas that seemed to ripple and shift of their own accord. Symbols similar to those we'd seen in the house had formed across his chest and back, raising from the skin like welts. "If this works," he said, "the parasite should be forced out or killed. If it doesn't..." He didn't finish the thought. Jack lowered himself into the tub, the specially prepared water coming up to his chest. I stood ready at the electrical control, a modified breaker box that would allow me to send current through the water. "Now," he said, gripping the sides of the tub. I threw the switch. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Jack's body convulsed violently, his back arching at an impossible angle. A scream tore from his throat, but not his voice, not human at all. It was that same overlapping chorus we'd heard in the house, using his vocal cords as an instrument. The water in the tub began to boil, not from heat, but from some reaction with whatever was inside Jack. His skin bulged in multiple places, as if something were trying to push its way out. The symbols on his skin glowed with that familiar green phosphorescence. Then, abruptly, something emerged from his mouth, not a solid form, but a churning mass of shadow and light that hovered above the water. It twisted in apparent agony as the current continued to flow through the tub. Jack's body went limp as the entity fully separated from him. The shadowy mass contracted, expanded, then imploded with a sound like thunder, leaving behind nothing but a faint scorch mark on the ceiling. I cut the power immediately, pulling Jack from the water. His skin had returned to normal human texture. The symbols faded to faint scars. He was breathing, but unconscious, his pulse weak but steady. Relief washed over me. It had worked. The parasite could be expelled. I was preparing the tub for my own treatment when Jack regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, normal color restored, focusing on me with recognition. "Did it work?" he asked, voice hoarse. "See for yourself." I helped him sit up, showing him his now normal skin. He examined his arms in wonder. "It's gone. I can feel it. That pressure in my mind. It's gone." I nodded, already moving toward the tub. "I need to do it now before mine progresses any further." Jack grabbed my arm, his expression suddenly grave. "Wait, there's something you should know. When it was connected to me, I could sense things. Its nature, its intentions. It wasn't just a parasite, it was a scout." "A scout for what?" "An invasion. What we saw in that doorway. That was just one entity. There are more, countless more, waiting for a stable connection to our world." I felt cold despite the humid air of the abandoned building. "Then we stopped it. We closed the door." Jack shook his head. "We delayed it, that's all. The house was one access point. There will be others." "We can find them," I said with determination I didn't entirely feel. "Shut them down like we did this one?" "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. "But first, let's get that thing out of you." My procedure went much like Jack's, though less dramatic given the earlier stage of my infestation. The pain was excruciating, like every cell in my body was being torn apart and reassembled. But when it ended, the sensation of foreign presence that had been growing within me had vanished. We destroyed the equipment afterward, not wanting anyone else to stumble upon it and potentially create new problems. The building itself we left intact, though Jack suggested burning it as well, to eliminate any trace of the entities we'd expelled. In the months since, we've maintained our vigilance, watching for signs of similar manifestations. Jack has developed a detection system based on the electromagnetic signatures we observed in the house, subtle irregularities that might indicate another doorway forming. We've identified 3 potential sites so far, each exhibiting the early warning signs: electronic malfunctions, spatial anomalies, and reports of strange sounds or sightings. We've intervened in 2 cases, using what we learned to seal the incipient connections before they could fully form. But we're only 2 people, and the potential access points seem to be increasing. Whatever exists on the other side of those doorways is persistent, patient, and seemingly infinite in its resources. Sometimes, in the deep hours of night, I still hear counting in the darkness of my bedroom, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And occasionally, in reflective surfaces, I glimpse something behind my own image, a suggestion of green light in my eyes that shouldn't be there, gone when I look directly. Jack insists I've been fully cleansed, that these are merely psychological after-effects of trauma. Perhaps he's right, or perhaps the connection is never truly severed, only weakened, temporarily suppressed. Either way, we continue our work, chronicling our findings and searching for others who might have encountered similar phenomena. The house at the end of Maple Street is gone, reduced to ashes and a condemned foundation that the city plans to eventually convert into a small park. But sometimes, driving past that empty lot at night, I see small figures standing at its perimeter, child-sized silhouettes visible only from the corner of my eye, gone when I turn to look directly. And from the car's speakers, no matter what station I tune to, comes the faint, distorted melody of a broken music box. The doorway may be closed for now, but something still waits on the other side, counting, listening, preparing. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I can almost hear it whisper, "Ready or not."